Falling for the Flake. A small-town rom-com with snowstorms, pies, and unexpected love. By Win Valentine. Copyright 2025 by Win Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities, is entirely coincidental. Win Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Created with vellum.
Chapter 1. Welcome to Winterberry Ridge. Piper tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her compact car performed yet another terrifying dance on the ice-slicked mountain road. The tires found purchase for a promising second, then slid sideways with a sickening lurch. Her heart hammered somewhere in her throat. Recalculating, her GPS announced in that infuriatingly calm voice. "No kidding," Piper muttered, squinting through the windshield. The wipers battled valiantly against the blizzard, but they were fighting a losing war. Each sweep cleared her view for exactly half a second before fresh snow obliterated it again. Come on. You've handled worse than this." She hadn't, actually. The worst driving conditions she'd ever faced were Seattle's occasional light dustings that melted by noon, or the moderate rainstorms that Bay Area residents treated like the apocalypse. Nothing like this whiteout that transformed the world into a disorienting snow globe. Her phone chirped a warning from its precarious perch in the cup holder. Piper darted a glance down, 2% battery. Perfect. This detour is fine, she told herself, channeling the same confidence she used when presenting strategy decks to nervous clients. Totally manageable. Just a small pivot in the plan. The rental car chose that exact moment to fishtail again. Piper yelped, overcorrected, and felt the stomach-dropping sensation of losing control completely. The world outside whirled in a blur of white and gray as the car spun, then came to a jarring halt with a sound between a thud and a crunch. For several seconds Piper just sat there, hands still death-gripping the wheel, breath coming in quick, shallow bursts that fogged the suddenly quiet interior. Beyond the windshield, snow swirled hypnotically. She blinked twice, focusing on something tall and rectangular, partially visible through the blizzard. A wooden sign, rustic and snow-capped. She made out the words "Welcome to Winterberry Ridge" carved in cheerful lettering, decorated with painted red berries and pine boughs. Underneath in smaller text, "Population 2,500, stay a while." Not by choice, Piper murmured. She twisted the key in the ignition. The engine made a pathetic whining noise, then fell silent. She tried again. Nothing. Not even the sad whine this time. No. Piper twisted the key harder, as if extra force might magically revive the dead engine. Don't you dare strand me here. I have a meeting on Monday. I have deadlines. Her phone gave one last defiant chirp and went black. 20 minutes later, Piper trudged through knee-deep snow, each step a small betrayal from her adorable ankle boots, perfect for a wine country weekend, catastrophically inadequate for an alpine snowstorm. Her thin wool coat, which the sales associate had described as substantial and perfect for fall to winter transition, now seemed laughably inadequate. The wind found every gap and seam, sending icy tendrils against her skin. "Once I find somewhere warm," she panted, her breath crystallizing, "I'll answer the Henderson emails first. Then finalize the Q1 projections. Maybe even get ahead on the Johnson presentation." Reciting her to-do list usually centered her. Right now, it just underscored how desperately far she was from her comfort zone. Piper Hart, who color-coded her planner and kept emergency protein bars in every bag, was now wandering through a blizzard in a town she couldn't even find on most maps. Her feet had gone from cold to painful to worryingly numb. The fashionable cream scarf around her neck was soaked through. Even her eyelashes felt heavy with ice. "This is how people die in movies," she muttered, then immediately regretted the thought. "Stop it. You're fine. Just need to find something." That's when she saw it, a golden glow cutting through the whiteness like a beacon. As she staggered closer, the light resolved into windows, warm and inviting. A small building with smoke curling from a chimney. Through the swirling snow, she made out a wooden sign swinging in the wind, "Frost and Crumb." A bakery. Civilization. Salvation. Piper lurched forward with renewed determination, nearly losing her footing on the icy steps leading to the entrance. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the door handle before she managed to wrench it open, practically falling inside as a gust of wind pushed at her back. Warmth hit her like a physical force. The temperature difference between the Arctic hellscape outside and the cozy interior actually hurt against her frozen cheeks and fingers. She stood just inside the doorway, dripping onto the wooden floor, a small snowdrift coming in with her. The scent hit her next, cinnamon, butter, vanilla, and something deeper and richer, maybe chocolate or coffee. Her empty stomach clenched painfully. Only then did Piper register the silence. The low hum of conversation that had been audible when she opened the door had ceased entirely. She blinked melting snow from her eyelashes and found herself the center of attention in a room full of strangers. About 15 people occupied the mismatched wooden tables scattered throughout the space. Every single one wore sensible flannel, thick sweaters, or sturdy overalls. Their boots, propped on chair rungs or planted firmly on the floor, were weathered, practical things meant for actual snow. Not a single person wore anything resembling her city chic ensemble. "Hi," she managed, attempting a smile that felt more like a grimace on her half-frozen face. From behind a rustic wooden counter, a man straightened. He'd been bent over something, dough, she realized, as flour dust caught the warm light when he moved. For a disorienting moment, Piper could only process fragments: broad shoulders under a Henley pushed to the elbows, strong forearms dusted with flour, dark hair that looked like someone had run frustrated hands through it. Then he turned fully toward her, and Piper found herself pinned by the most startlingly blue eyes she'd ever seen. Steel blue, she thought inanely, like a winter sky before snow. Eyes currently narrowed with unmistakable annoyance. "Door," the man said, his voice a low rumble. "You're letting in half the blizzard." "Oh. Sorry." Piper fumbled behind her to close the door, nearly losing her balance in the process. Her numb legs wobbled beneath her. The man, the baker she presumed, crossed his arms. A light dusting of flour transferred from his forearms to his chest, but he either didn't notice or didn't care. "You do realize there's a travel advisory in effect? Roads are closed north of Pine Ridge Junction." Piper slipped effortlessly into her work persona, the one that got her through client meltdowns and impossible deadlines. She straightened her shoulders and summoned what her colleagues called her can-do smile. "Yes, slight miscalculation on my part. I was actually heading to Cedar Springs Resort when my GPS rerouted me. My car decided to get intimate with a snowbank about half a mile back." She gestured vaguely toward the door, leaving out the part where she'd ignored increasingly concerned alerts on her phone about deteriorating conditions. "I was hoping to find a tow service. And maybe a place to stay for the night?" The baker's expression didn't soften. If anything, the crease between his brows deepened. "Tow service won't make it up here until the storm breaks," he said flatly. "Tony doesn't take his rig out when visibility's under 50 feet. Bad for business to end up needing a tow for the tow truck." A ripple of knowing chuckles ran through the room. Piper felt her professional smile slipping. "I see. Well, I noticed a sign for the Ridgeview Inn when I was driving in. I could." "That's a 6-mile walk," the baker cut in. "In a whiteout. In those." His gaze dropped pointedly to her boots, which were currently creating a small puddle on his floor. Heat crept up Piper's neck that had nothing to do with the bakery's warmth. "They're more durable than they look," she lied. The boots had been purchased solely for their ability to transition from client meetings to after-work cocktails. One of his eyebrows ticked up, eloquently calling her bluff without words. An elderly woman at a corner table cleared her throat. "You headed to Cedar Springs for work or pleasure, dear?" The question caught Piper off guard after the baker's brusque assessment. "Oh, a bit of both, actually." Another lie slipped out before she could stop it. "I'm a travel blogger. I was planning to feature the resort in a piece on hidden winter getaways." Why had she said that? Piper didn't even have an Instagram account, let alone a travel blog. The baker made a sound suspiciously like a snort. His gaze flicked to her wrist, specifically to the sleek watch that had been a gift to herself after closing the Henderson account. Then to her bag where her leather planner was just visible, its color-coded tabs peeking out. "So you thought documenting our quaint little town was worth risking your life in a blizzard?" His voice was desert dry. "I didn't realize how serious it was," Piper admitted, some of her composure finally cracking. "Look, can you recommend anywhere I might stay tonight? I'm happy to pay whatever." The phone rang, its old-fashioned jangle cutting through the tension. The baker gave her one last inscrutable look before turning to answer it. "Frost and crumb," he said, then listened for a moment. "Yeah, Betty, I figured that might happen." "How many trees?" Another pause. "That bad?" No, don't send Theo out in this. I'll figure something out." Piper tried not to eavesdrop, but the alternative was facing the curious stares still directed her way. She caught fragments, "rooms all booked, east wing snowed in, power flickering." Her stomach sank. Even without context, it wasn't hard to guess the gist of the conversation. The baker hung up and ran a hand through his hair, confirming Piper's theory about its disheveled state. He turned back to her with a complicated expression, part resigned, part annoyed, part something she couldn't quite place. That was Mrs. Farnsworth from the Ridgeview. "They're full up with the winter festival crowd, and now they've got a tree down on part of the building." He exhaled heavily. "Even if you could make it there, they don't have rooms." Piper's mind raced through her dwindling options. Is there another inn? A motel? I really don't mind. "There's not," he said flatly. "Ridgeview's it." A silence fell. Piper became acutely aware of how cold and wet she was, how tired her legs felt after plowing through snowdrifts, how out of place she looked among these sensibly dressed locals. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she had no plan B. The baker stared at her for a long moment, something working behind those blue eyes. Finally, he heaved a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I've got a spare room," he said, the words sounding like they'd been forcibly extracted. "Above the bakery. You can stay there until the road's clear or the inn has space. Whichever comes first." Piper blinked, caught between desperate gratitude and uncertainty. "That's incredibly kind of you." "It's not kindness," he corrected. "It's basic human decency. Don't make me regret it." "I won't," she promised quickly. "And I'll pay you, of course." He waved that away. "We'll settle up later." He glanced at the wall clock. "I close in 20. You can wait by the fire until then." With that, he turned back to his work, effectively dismissing her. Piper stood awkwardly for a moment before making her way to the empty chair closest to the stone fireplace. As she sank into it, the warmth of the flames began to thaw her frozen extremities, bringing with it the uncomfortable pins and needles of returning circulation. She covertly studied the baker as he worked. Despite his curtness, his movements held a fluid grace. His large hands were surprisingly gentle with the dough he shaped. Customers approached the counter, and though he wasn't exactly friendly, something in his demeanor shifted subtly. He knew each person by name. He remembered their regular orders. And when a small girl in pigtails and a puffy pink coat came up with $1 clutched in her mitten, he crouched down to eye level and solemnly handed her a cookie easily worth 3 times that amount. The locals clearly respected him. Several nodded deferentially. Others engaged in brief, comfortable exchanges that spoke of long familiarity. Yet Piper noticed the buffer zone they maintained, a careful few feet, as if they sensed his preference for space. An hour later, the last customers had gone, braving the storm in their sensible gear and four-wheel drives. Piper stood by the door as the baker, who still hadn't offered his name, locked up and flipped the sign to closed. "My place is behind the bakery," he said, grabbing a heavy coat from a hook. "It's not far, but in this weather, even short walks are tricky. Stay close." He pulled a knitted hat over his dark hair and wrapped a scarf around his neck with the efficiency of someone who'd done it thousands of times. Piper adjusted her own pathetic excuse for winter accessories and braced herself. The moment they stepped outside, the wind tried to rip the breath from her lungs. She gasped, ducking her head against the onslaught. The baker moved ahead with confident strides, forging a path through the snow. Piper struggled to follow, her legs protesting after her earlier trek. He glanced back once, noted her difficulty, but didn't slow down. The part of Piper that thrived on proving herself pushed her forward, refusing to show weakness. She forced her aching legs to move faster, nearly catching up to him as they rounded the corner of the building. The town square was just visible through the curtain of snow, a charming, postcard-worthy scene under different circumstances. She glimpsed a clock tower rising above the other buildings, and as if on cue, it began to chime. The sound carried eerily through the storm, marking the hour with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in her chest. 6 chimes. Only 6 in the evening, yet the combination of the blizzard and early winter darkness made it feel like midnight. Piper tried to calculate when she might reasonably get back on the road, when she could contact her team, when she could reclaim control of her meticulously scheduled life. Nothing but uncertainty stretched before her. The baker unlocked a door set into the back of the building and ushered her inside. Piper stumbled over the threshold, the contrast between the howling storm and sudden stillness disorienting. "So," she said, breaking the awkward silence as she unwound her sodden scarf, "I feel like I should know the name of the person giving me shelter during the storm of the century." Those blue eyes assessed her for a moment. "Jack," he finally said. "Jack Whitmore." "Piper Hart," she replied, extending her hand on autopilot. "Thank you for rescuing me, Jack. I promise I won't be in your way for long." His hand engulfed hers, warm and slightly rough, with calluses that spoke of physical work. The brief contact sent a surprising jolt up her arm. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Piper Hart." His lips quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile, the first she'd seen from him. No one leaves Winterberry Ridge until the snow decides they can.
Chapter 2. House Rules. Jack jolted awake at precisely 4:27 a.m., 3 minutes before his alarm. The old farmhouse creaked around him, its familiar sounds now interspersed with something foreign, the whisper of someone else's presence under his roof. He'd barely slept, hyper-aware of the stranger down the hall. Even with the bedroom door closed, he'd found himself straining to hear any movement, any sign that his uninvited guest might be disturbing the careful order of his home. He silenced his alarm before it could sound and swung his legs over the side of the bed, pressing his feet against the cold hardwood floor. The shock of chill against his skin was grounding, part of the dependable rhythm that structured his days. Jack paused outside the guest room, his flannel sleep pants and worn t-shirt rumpled from a night of restless tossing. The door was firmly closed, not how he'd left it. He leaned closer, catching the soft, even sounds of breathing. Still asleep then. Good. He needed at least an hour of solitude before dealing with whatever her name was. Piper. Like she was some kind of cheerful woodland instrument, instead of a chaos agent who'd crashed into his carefully constructed life. The kitchen welcomed him with its familiar shadows. He moved on autopilot, avoiding the creaky floorboard 3 steps in, his hands finding items by muscle memory rather than sight. The house had been his grandparents' before his, and he knew every inch of it, the way he knew the lines of his own palm. Jack reached for his sourdough starter, lifting the cloth cover to check its progress. The sour smell hit him, comforting and alive. He added flour and water by feel, his forearms flexing as he mixed, watching the gluten strands develop in the dim light filtering through the kitchen window. Snow was still coming down, thick and determined. The world outside his window was pure white, the kind of snow that devoured sound and changed landscapes overnight. 3 days, he muttered to himself, estimating how long before the roads would be clear enough for her to leave. 3 days maximum. He could handle 3 days. He'd survived worse. A speech formed in his head as he worked the dough. Clear boundaries, simple rules. No emotional involvement. The last visitor from outside Winterberry Ridge had nearly wrecked him. Lindsay had called everything here quaint, had promised she loved the rustic charm right up until the moment she decided charm didn't compensate for what she called middle-of-nowhere monotony. She'd left with a piece of him he couldn't seem to get back. This Piper woman, with her impractical boots and city-slick manner, was cut from the same cloth. He'd seen it immediately, the way her eyes catalogued everything as if filing it away for future reference, the way she'd performed enthusiasm about the town as if it were some kind of theme park rather than people's homes and livelihoods. Travel blogger. Right. The coffee maker gurgled to life as the kitchen gradually brightened. Jack moved efficiently, lining up tools for the day's first batches. 2 ceramic mugs sat side by side on the counter, his usual one, a sturdy handmade piece with a deep blue glaze, and beside it an older mug with a small chip on the rim. Second best for second priority people. A floorboard creaked in the hallway and Jack's shoulders tensed. He didn't turn around. "Oh. Good morning," Piper's voice carried a forced cheeriness that set his teeth on edge. "I didn't realize anyone would be up this early." Jack glanced at the stove clock, 5:07 a.m. "Bakery hours," he said flatly, still not turning. "Coffee's ready." He could feel her hovering in the doorway, hesitating. Good. Let her feel the awkwardness. The displacement. Maybe she'd understand she didn't belong here. "Smells amazing," she offered, stepping into the kitchen. "Is that sourdough?" Jack finally turned, coffee pot in hand. The sight of her momentarily disrupted his mental script. Her blonde hair was twisted in a messy knot on top of her head, her face scrubbed clean of yesterday's makeup. She looked younger, less polished in flannel pajama pants and an oversized sweatshirt with a faded college logo. The outfit was practical, at least, maybe the first practical thing he'd seen from her. "Black okay?" he asked, ignoring her question about the bread. "Perfect. Thank you." She accepted the chipped mug with both hands, cradling it like it contained something precious instead of just plain dark roast. "I can make my own breakfast if you point me toward." "There's rules," Jack interrupted, setting his own mug down with a decisive click against the countertop. "If you're staying here." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Of course." 1. The bakery is my workspace, not a tourist attraction. You stay out of my way. He ticked the points off on his fingers. 2. This is temporary. The second the road's clear enough for your car to be towed into town, you find other arrangements. Reasonable, she agreed, taking a small sip of coffee. And 3? Jack blinked. Was she mocking him? But her expression seemed genuinely attentive. 3, he continued, a bit thrown off, you don't touch my baking equipment. Not at home, not at the shop. Piper nodded seriously. Anything else? The rational part of his brain knew he should probably soften a little, offer some basic hospitality. But something about her composed acceptance of his rules only irritated him further. Where was the pushback? The offense. It was like she was humoring him, and somehow that was worse. Just don't get too comfortable, he added, turning back to his dough. People who pass through never really understand what Winterberry Ridge is about anyway. In his peripheral vision, he saw her flinch slightly. Good. Maybe she dropped the act now. But instead, she just took another sip of coffee. Fair enough. For what it's worth, I appreciate the roof over my head. Not everyone would have helped a stranger. The simple gratitude threw him off balance again. He grunted in response, focusing on the dough beneath his hands. The bathroom's down the hall, he said after an uncomfortable silence. We leave in 20 minutes. The snow had piled higher overnight, transforming the town into something from a storybook. Jack trudged ahead through knee-deep drifts, deliberately maintaining several paces between them. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but the sting was familiar, almost welcome. Behind him, Piper's boots squeaked against the snow as she struggled to keep up. Every few seconds he heard a little oof as she sank deeper than expected into a drift. He ignored it. He'd warned her about the weather, hadn't he? This is incredible. Her voice carried on the crystal-clear winter air. The perfect winter wonderland aesthetic. Those icicles on the eaves look like something from a movie set. Jack rolled his eyes. Of course she'd see it that way, like a film backdrop instead of the reality of pipes freezing and ice dams threatening roof damage. Are those fairy lights still on in all the shop windows? That's so charming, she continued, undeterred by his silence. I bet it's magical at night. Do you keep them up all winter, or just for whoa? The sound of flailing and a soft thump made him stop and turn despite himself. Piper had sunk almost to her thighs in a particularly deep drift, her arms windmilling for balance. You good? He asked flatly, though something in his chest tightened at how red her cheeks had already grown from the cold. Totally fine. She laughed, brushing snow from her jeans. Just finding the deeper spots with scientific precision. Her shoes were completely impractical. Some kind of fashionable ankle boots with decorative buckles and absolutely no insulation. They'd be soaked through within minutes. An inner voice that sounded suspiciously like his grandmother told him to stop being a complete ass. There's a path with less snow this way, he found himself saying, gesturing to a route that hugged closer to the buildings. The awnings block some of it. He didn't wait for her response, but he did slow his pace marginally. Just to ensure he didn't have to double back if she got truly stuck. Purely practical. The back door of Frost and Crumb welcomed him like an old friend. Jack breathed deeply as he stepped inside, savoring the lingering scents of yesterday's baking, vanilla, cinnamon, the nutty richness of brown butter. His shoulders dropped a half-inch, muscles relaxing in the familiar space. The ritual began, as it always did. Lights, first the kitchen and then the soft, warm ones that illuminated the display cases. The ovens came next, the gentle hum of elements heating a reassuring backdrop. He moved with the ease of thousands of identical mornings, measuring ingredients by eye and feel rather than cups and spoons. This place is even cuter in daylight, Piper said, breaking his concentration. She'd been uncharacteristically quiet since they'd arrived, settling at a small table in the corner with her notebook. Now she was moving around the space, examining vintage rolling pins mounted on the wall, peering into the glass-fronted cabinets where he stored special ingredients. Jack's jaw tightened. There's coffee over there, he said, jerking his head toward the small station near the register. Help yourself. But don't touch the baking equipment. I remember. She smiled, undaunted. What are these tiny canisters for? Specialty salts, he answered reflexively, then regretted engaging. He turned back to his dough, rolling it with perhaps more force than necessary. Do you make anything besides pies? The sign outside mentions crumb, like it might be crumble or... We make whatever I feel like making, he cut her off. Seasonally appropriate. And what feels appropriate today? She asked, seemingly immune to his coldness. The question brought him up short. No one asked him that. Everyone in Winterberry Ridge knew his rotation, knew what to expect on which days. Thursday is hand pies and spice scones, he said after a moment. Plus whatever's been requested for special orders. Requested how? Do you have a form or system or? The jingling of the front door bell saved him from having to answer. Jack glanced at the clock, frowning slightly. 6:17 a.m. No one came this early except Jackson Whitmore. There you are, right on schedule. Mrs. Farnsworth's imperious voice preceded her into the kitchen, along with the tap of her unnecessary walking cane. I was just saying to Walter, I bet that boy already has the ovens hot enough to warm these old bones. Jack bit back a smile despite himself. Morning, Mrs. Farnsworth. You're early. Am I? She feigned surprise, her sharp eyes already fixed on Piper. "Oh my! You have company. How unusual." The emphasis she placed on the last word made Jack's ears heat. "This is Piper Hart," he said, hating the awkward formality in his voice. "Her car went off the road in the storm. She's staying at my place temporarily." "Is she now?" Mrs. Farnsworth's thin eyebrows reached toward her hairline. "How very providential. A young woman appears just when we need fresh blood for the Winter Festival Committee." "Oh, I'm just passing through," Piper said quickly. "Once the road's clear." Yes, that's what they all say." Mrs. Farnsworth waved a dismissive hand. "But no one truly passes through Winterberry Ridge in December, my dear. The snow has its own ideas." Jack recognized the gleam in the older woman's eye. It was the same look she got before assigning bachelor farmers as dance partners to unattached women at the Harvest Festival. "Mrs. Farnsworth collects strays," he explained to Piper, knowing it would irritate the older woman. "Especially the two-legged variety." "And you're one to talk, Jackson Oliver," Mrs. Farnsworth sniffed. "Taking in a pretty young thing, without so much as a proper introduction to the town. What's your profession, dear?" "I'm a trail." "She's a travel blogger," Jack interrupted, surprising himself by jumping in. "Writing about small towns." "Is she?" Mrs. Farnsworth's gaze sharpened further. "Not your usual type, Jackson." Jack nearly dropped the tray of scones he'd been about to slide into the oven. We're not," he sputtered, horrified. "Goodness, I meant she's not your usual customer type." So touchy. The old woman's innocent expression fooled no one. "I'll take a blueberry scone and chamomile tea. And perhaps Miss Hart would join me. I know all the best stories about Winterberry Ridge." Jack recognized a tactical retreat when he needed to make one. "Piper, why don't you sit with Mrs. Farnsworth while I finish the first batch?" It wasn't really a question. Piper looked like she might object, but after a glance at his face, she smiled brightly at the older woman. "I'd love to hear about the town." "Excellent." Mrs. Farnsworth guided Piper toward a table, with a proprietary hand on her elbow. "Now tell me, dear, are you seeing anyone special back home?" Jack turned the oven dial with more force than necessary, cranking the music in the kitchen to drown out whatever scheme Mrs. Farnsworth was concocting. The woman had unsuccessfully tried to set him up with the new mail carrier, 2 different nurses from the clinic, and her own grandniece in the last year alone. He lost himself in the rhythm of baking, the kitchen gradually filling with the scents of butter and sugar and spice. The early winter morning light streamed through the windows, catching on the copper measuring cups hanging from a rack. For a few precious minutes, he almost forgot about the disruption to his routine. Until he turned and found Piper behind the counter, rearranging his display case. "What are you doing?" he demanded, setting down his spatula with deliberate care. "Oh." She looked up, hands still moving items around. "I noticed you have these grouped by type, but if you arrange them by color instead, it creates a more appetizing visual flow. See?" She gestured to where she'd rearranged his precisely ordered rows of pastries into some kind of rainbow pattern. "No." Jack moved toward the case. "No, I don't see. Those were organized by baking time and expiration. Now I have no idea which ones need to be sold first." "But this will encourage people to buy more," she argued, not backing down. "Visual merchandising is all about creating patterns that lead the eye across the entire selection, instead of letting them focus on just one area." "This isn't some corporate chain with marketing analysts," Jack snapped. "These are handmade goods that people come here specifically to buy. I don't need tricks." "It's not a trick," she insisted, crossing her arms. "It's basic business sense. Don't you want to maximize your sales?" "What I want," he said through gritted teeth, "is to follow the system that's worked for the last 30 years. He began moving the pastries back to their original positions. To his surprise, Piper didn't retreat. "The system where you just do whatever your father did, without considering alternatives?" Jack's head snapped up, a retort ready on his lips. But the directness in her hazel eyes gave him pause. Under different circumstances, he might have respected her backbone. "The system where I know exactly what my customers expect," he said finally, a degree less heat in his voice. "And where Mrs. Farnsworth doesn't get a cranberry scone that's been sitting out a day too long." Piper held his gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable, then shrugged. "Fair enough. But you're missing an opportunity." "I'll live with the regret," he muttered, turning away. The morning rush at Frost and Crumb wasn't anything like the frenetic chaos of city cafes, but it had its own steady rhythm. By 7:30, the small seating area was comfortably filled with the usual Thursday crowd: Gus and Walter playing chess by the window, Sophie from the elementary school picking up her standard half-dozen scones for the teacher's lounge, Ted Lawson grabbing his daily black coffee and cranberry muffin. "Snowed in completely up at the North Ridge," Ted reported, leaning against the counter. "Marley says it might be Saturday before the plow gets all the way up there." "Elsie's got enough supplies?" Jack asked, already mentally calculating what he'd need to send over if the elderly woman was truly stranded. "Got a care package to her yesterday," Ted nodded. "But she mentioned being low on her heart medication. Thought I'd snowmobile over this afternoon if Doc Jensen can spare a refill." "Take her one of the apple pies in the back fridge," Jack said, keeping his voice casual. "And some of the butter rolls. For the trouble." Ted grinned. "You old softy. She said you'd say that." Jack waved him off, embarrassed as always by any acknowledgement of kindness. "Just being practical. She's a good customer." From the corner of his eye he spotted Piper watching the exchange, that damn notebook open in front of her. She wrote something down, then caught his gaze and quickly looked away, studying him like some small-town specimen, collecting local color for her blog or whatever story she was really pursuing. "Is that the young lady who went off Miller's Curve?" Ted asked in a stage whisper that carried easily in the small shop. Heard from Fritz, who heard from Sheriff Dawson, that some city girl nearly ended up in the ravine. "News travels fast," Jack muttered. "Well, it's not every day we get fresh faces around here," Ted said cheerfully. "Especially ones that pretty. You keeping her at your place, then?" Jack's ears burned. "Temporarily. Until the road's clear." Ted waggled his eyebrows. Sure. Temporarily." "Don't start, Ted," Jack warned. The older man just laughed, gathering his coffee and pastry. "All I'm saying is, sometimes the biggest blessings come disguised as accidents." "Out," Jack pointed to the door, fighting a reluctant smile. "Before I tell Marjorie you've been skipping your cholesterol meds again." Ted clutched his chest in mock horror. "You fight dirty, Whitmore," he said, backing toward the exit. "But I like your style." As the door closed behind Ted, Jack became aware of Piper's voice carrying from the far corner. She was talking to old Mr. Wilson, her expression animated as she gestured with her hands. "Oh, I've been to dozens of small towns for my travel blog," she was saying. "But none with quite the charm of Winterberry Ridge. The way the storefronts all coordinate their decorations. Clearly, there's a real community spirit here." Jack rolled his eyes as he wiped down the counter. There was no town ordinance about decorations. It was just that most of the shops had been handed down through the same families for generations, and they all used the decorations stored in the shared attic space above the pharmacy. Nothing coordinated about it. Just practical reuse. "In Mapleton, they have this adorable tradition with lanterns," Piper continued confidently. "And in Spruce Harbor, the whole town dresses up for their winter solstice parade. It's heartwarming, really, how these traditions endure." Mr. Wilson nodded along, clearly charmed. Jack wasn't even sure Mapleton and Spruce Harbor were real places. He watched as Piper smoothly guided the conversation, asking just the right questions to keep the older man talking. For someone supposedly documenting authentic small-town life, she sure was doing a lot of the talking herself. Yet as she listened to Mr. Wilson describe the legendary blizzard of '87, her expression shifted into something that looked genuinely interested. The animated performance quality dropped away for a moment. Jack found himself studying the change, the way her shoulders relaxed and her smile became less practiced. "Interesting." Maybe there was more to Ms. Hart than just carefully constructed charm. He turned away before she could catch him watching again, focusing on his true passion, the pie crusts for the day's specialties. This was the moment he lived for each morning. The perfect butter-to-flour ratio. The ice water drizzled just so. The gentle touch that kept the dough from toughening. Jack worked silently, letting muscle memory guide him. His grandfather had taught him this technique, standing behind him with gnarled hands guiding his small ones, murmuring instructions that had become a meditation over the years. Not too much handling, Jackie boy. Respect the dough, and it'll respect you back. Without thinking, he found himself whispering the familiar mantra as he created the pie crust. Cold hands, warm heart. Gentle touch, strong finish. A small sound made him glance up. Piper stood across the kitchen, eyes fixed on his hands as they worked the dough. The morning light caught the gold in her hazel eyes, making them appear almost amber. Something in her expression, open, curious, without the polished veneer she usually wore, caught him off guard. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, Jack felt strangely exposed, as if she'd glimpsed something intimate in watching this ritual. He looked away first, turning his back as he continued working the dough. Not for beginners, he muttered, more to break the silence than anything. I wouldn't dream of it, she said softly. It clearly requires a genuine touch. The gentleness in her voice unnerved him more than her earlier challenges had. He focused intently on the task, ears burning, not looking up again until he was certain she'd moved away. The midday lull found Jack aggressively wiping down already clean counters. The morning had been busier than usual, a parade of locals just stopping in with increasingly flimsy excuses to check out the visitor. Mrs. Farnsworth's gossip network had been operating at peak efficiency. Need a refill? Jack looked up, startled to find Piper beside him, coffee pot in hand. She'd somehow refilled the commercial brewer without him noticing, and the fresh scent of dark roast filled the air. Oh, thanks. He held out his mug, off balance again. You didn't have to do that. She shrugged. Figured it was the least I could do. I also wiped down the tables. Hope that's okay. I didn't touch any actual baking equipment. Jack glanced around, noticing the gleaming tabletops and neatly arranged chairs. It's fine, he managed. Great. So, she continued, filling her own mug, how long have you owned this place? The direct question was easier to handle than her unexpected helpfulness. Officially 8 years. But I grew up in it. Family business. He nodded, taking a long sip of coffee to avoid elaborating. Do you ever get tired of making the same things over and over? She asked. Or is it comforting to have the routine? Something about the question struck Jack as genuine, lacking the usual tourist judgment about small-town repetition. Before he could formulate an answer, though, the kitchen timer buzzed. Apple bourbon lattice, he said, moving toward the ovens. Need to check on them. Piper followed him, watching as he opened the oven door and assessed the golden crust with a critical eye. They needed 3 more minutes for the perfect color. They're beautiful, she said, and again that note of sincerity caught him by surprise. Really stunning work. Jack cleared his throat. They're not done yet. Still. She leaned against the far counter, cradling her coffee mug. You clearly love what you do. There was something about the simple observation, neither a question nor a judgment, that bypassed his usual defenses. It's what makes sense to me, he found himself saying. Taking separate ingredients that are nothing special on their own, and creating something worth sharing. The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted their honesty. He busied himself checking the other ovens, hoping she wouldn't press further. To his relief, she just nodded thoughtfully. I understand that, she said after a moment. Finding the one thing that makes all the pieces fit together. The unexpected alignment in their perspectives unsettled him. He grunted noncommittally and turned his attention to the rack of cooling hand pies. The sky was already darkening as Jack locked up Frost and Crumb at the end of the day. Fresh snow had begun to fall again, fat lazy flakes that drifted down in the golden glow of the streetlights. He buttoned his coat against the biting wind and set off toward home, footsteps crunching in the snow. Piper fell into step beside him, bundled in the too thin coat she'd arrived in. Jack deliberately maintained his distance, not wanting a repeat of that strange moment of connection from the morning. Yet he found himself casting sideways glances at her as they walked, noting the way snowflakes caught in her hair, the slight redness of her nose in the cold. "The way the buildings are laid out is really interesting," she was saying, undeterred by his silence. "I noticed the older structures are all angled to block the north wind, and the newer additions follow the same pattern. It's like the whole town was designed with winter in mind." Jack blinked, surprised by the observation. Most visitors only commented on the quaint appearance, not the practical architecture. "That's right," he admitted. "The original settlers built that way, to create windbreaks. Each generation just continued the pattern." "Smart," she nodded. "I also noticed everyone has those little shelves by their front doors for boots. And the metal grates embedded in the sidewalks near the storefronts, are those for melting snow." "Heated runoff system," Jack confirmed. "Installed in the 1950s. Keeps the walkways from icing over." They continued in silence for a few steps, the only sound the whisper of snowfall and the crunch of their boots. It was comfortable, almost. Less irritating than her constant questions had been earlier. "You really notice details," he said finally, surprising himself. Piper smiled, a different smile than she'd used with the customers, smaller, but somehow more genuine. "Occupational hazard," she said. "I spend a lot of time analyzing environments and systems." A part of him wanted to ask what she really did for work. The travel blogger story was flimsy at best, and clearly constructed on the spot. But asking might make it seem like he cared, which he definitely didn't. She'd be gone in a couple of days anyway. "Oh!" Piper's exclamation broke into his thoughts. Her foot had hit a patch of black ice hidden beneath the fresh snow, and she wobbled precariously, arms pinwheeling. Pure reflex had Jack reaching out, his hand closing around hers to steady her. The contact was brief, just long enough to help her regain balance, but he felt the warmth of her skin against his cold fingers like a physical shock. "Thanks," she breathed, her cheeks flushed from either the cold or the near fall. "Watch your step," he said gruffly, withdrawing his hand immediately. "These paths get slick after dark." They continued onward, Jack now hyper-aware of the space between them. The momentary touch lingered like a phantom sensation against his palm. He stuffed his hands deep into his pockets, telling himself it was just the winter air making his chest feel tight. Tomorrow, he'd reinforce the boundaries. Make it clear that this arrangement was strictly temporary, a matter of practical necessity. He'd maintain proper distance. Get back to his routine. The resolution firm in his mind, Jack walked slightly faster, focusing on the path ahead and ignoring the strange, unwelcome warmth that had nothing to do with the weather.
Chapter 3. Snowed in and stirred up. Piper stirred at an unfamiliar sensation. Something was wrong. Her dreams dissolved into the cold reality of Jack's spare room, where the temperature had plummeted to something that felt arctic. Consciousness returned in stages, first the biting chill on her nose, then the weight of what felt like 1,000 pounds of blankets that somehow weren't doing their job. "You have got to be kidding me," she whispered into the pitch darkness, her words materializing as vapor clouds. She fumbled blindly for her phone, knocking over what was probably a glass of water in the process. The screen illuminated, temporarily blinding her. 3:17 a.m. The ancient radiator, that had been her nighttime companion, with its rhythmic clanking, had fallen eerily silent. Shivering violently, Piper wrapped the quilt around her shoulders and slid her feet into the fuzzy socks she'd thankfully packed. She layered on every item of clothing she could find in the dark, her sweater over her pajama top, leggings under her pajama bottoms, and a scarf wound around her neck. The final touch was a mismatched pair of socks pulled over her already socked feet. Fashion disaster, but at least her toes might survive till morning. "This is fine," she muttered unconvincingly, teeth chattering. Totally part of the authentic small-town winter experience. Guided by her phone's flashlight, Piper crept down the hallway toward Jack's room. She rehearsed opening lines in her head, aiming for the sweet spot between damsel in distress and reasonable adult with a legitimate concern. "Hey Jack, sorry to wake you, but I think we might be slowly freezing to death. Is it normal for indoor temperatures to match the freezer section at Whole Foods? Quick question, should I be able to see my breath indoors?" Her fingers hovered over Jack's door, not quite making contact, when his deep voice came through the darkness. "Power's out. Blown fuse. Happens in storms." Piper jumped back, her heart racing. "Geez. How did you know I was here?" "Floorboards creak by your room. Heard you get up." The door opened, revealing Jack in flannel pajama pants and a thermal shirt, looking rumpled and surprisingly human without his usual scowl. His hair stuck up on one side, and the vulnerability of it made something flutter in Piper's chest. "So we're freezing because of a fuse?" she asked, hugging herself. "Probably. Could be the lines." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Basement, come on." Wordlessly, Piper followed him down a narrow staircase, aiming her phone's beam at their feet. The basement was cramped and smelled of potatoes and dust. Jack moved with the confidence of familiarity, while Piper hovered awkwardly behind him. "Hold this," he instructed, passing her a heavy-duty flashlight from a shelf. She trained it on the fuse box as he opened it and examined the switches. "Winterberry's grid isn't what you'd call robust," he explained, flipping several switches back and forth. "Old wiring, heavy snow on the lines. Town council keeps promising upgrades." Standing this close, Piper could see the strong lines of his shoulders beneath the thermal shirt. A distinct spattering of flour still clung to his forearm, despite what she assumed had been a pre-bed shower. Occupational hazard for a baker, she supposed. "Yeah, this isn't something I can fix," he finally declared, closing the box with a snap. "We'll have to wait for the power company." When he turned, their eyes met in the beam of light. For once, neither looked away immediately. Something passed between them, recognition maybe, or simply the absurdity of their situation. "So what now?" Piper asked, her breath a visible puff between them.
"We go to the bakery."
"At 3 in the morning?" "It has a fireplace," he said simply. "Unless you prefer hypothermia." 15 minutes later, Piper found herself wading through knee-deep snow behind Jack. He'd lent her a pair of boots that were comically large, forcing her to take exaggerated steps to keep them on. The town was eerily beautiful in the dark, streetlights out, just moonlight reflecting off endless white. The storm had tapered to gentle flurries that caught in her eyelashes. "Can you hurry it up back there?" Jack called over his shoulder. "I'm basically wearing clown shoes," she shot back, then promptly lost her balance on a patch of ice. Her arms windmilled wildly. Jack spun around just in time to catch her wrist. His reflexive grab seemed to surprise even him, his eyes widening slightly as his fingers circled her arm. The contact sent a jolt through Piper that had nothing to do with the cold. His palm was calloused but warm against her skin. "These roads are a lawsuit waiting to happen," she said, trying to cover the sudden flutter in her chest. "You city people and your lawsuits," he muttered, but didn't release her immediately. When he did, his fingers seemed to linger for a fraction longer than necessary. The bakery was a different place in darkness. Moonlight streamed through the frosted windows, casting blue shadows across the counters and tables. Without the bustle of customers and the scent of fresh pastries, it felt almost sacred, a temple to flour and sugar temporarily at rest. Jack moved through the space with practiced efficiency, even in near darkness. He disappeared into a back room, returning with an armload of firewood and several thick blankets. "Don't just stand there," he said, nodding toward a stack of chairs. "Bring those over by the hearth." Piper felt an unexpected relief at being given a task. Following orders was better than awkwardly hovering, watching Jack's confident movements while she contributed nothing. She arranged the chairs in a semicircle facing the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the bakery. "I didn't know bakeries came with fireplaces," she said, aiming for conversational. "This building's from 1893, Jack replied, kneeling before the hearth. Back then, everyone had fireplaces. He began arranging logs and kindling with experienced hands. Hand me that newspaper. Piper passed him a folded copy of the Winterberry Weekly from a nearby table. Their fingers brushed, and she felt that same ripple of awareness. You ever build a fire before? He asked. Does lighting birthday candles count? He snorted. Come here. You should know how to do this. To her surprise, Jack shifted aside, making room for her to kneel beside him. The stone floor was cold through her layers, but the prospect of learning something practical, and the proximity to Jack's warmth, made it tolerable. Kindling goes like this, he explained, demonstrating the arrangement of smaller sticks. Always build with airspace. Fire needs to breathe. Piper watched his hands strong and sure as they worked. When he motioned for her to try, she carefully imitated his pattern. Not bad, he conceded, the closest thing to praise she'd received since arriving in Winterberry Ridge. Together they built the fire, Jack guiding her through each step. Their shoulders occasionally bumped as they worked side by side, each contact sent a small current through her. When the fire finally caught, golden light bloomed across his features. The flickering glow softened the edges that seemed so sharp in daylight, highlighting cheekbones she hadn't properly noticed before and catching in his eyelashes. Piper found herself staring a moment too long. What? He asked, catching her gaze. Nothing, she said quickly. Just impressed by your wilderness skills. Building a fire in a perfectly good fireplace isn't exactly wilderness skills. But the corner of his mouth twitched upward. They arranged themselves on the floor before the fireplace, wrapped in separate blankets but positioned close enough to share the heat. Jack leaned back against the base of an armchair, while Piper huddled cross-legged beside him. The space between them was minimal but deliberate, proper enough not to be intimate, close enough to benefit from each other's warmth. Piper found herself hyper-aware of Jack's presence. The rhythm of his breathing, the way firelight played across the planes of his face, the slight woodsy scent that clung to him beneath the ever-present notes of vanilla and cinnamon. This quiet version of him seemed different from the baker who barked orders during business hours. So, she ventured after a stretch of surprisingly comfortable silence, third-generation baker, huh? Jack looked at her questioningly. The sign, she explained. It says Frost and Crumb, Est, 1947. He nodded. My grandfather opened it after the war. Then my dad took over in the 80s. Now it's me. Did you always know you'd be a baker? Jack poked at the fire with an iron, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Not always. But it's in the blood, I guess. Is that why you came back from culinary school? His eyebrows rose slightly. Town gossip machine works fast, I see. Who told you that? Mrs. Farnsworth might have mentioned it, Piper admitted. Of course she did. He sighed. Yeah, I was in Boston for a while. Came back when Dad's heart started giving him trouble. And stayed, Piper supplied. And stayed, he echoed, his gaze fixed on the fire. They fell into conversation, hesitant at first, then gradually more fluid. Jack explained how the storm had likely knocked out a transformer, and that the town's electrical infrastructure dated back to the 1970s. Piper asked about the bakery's history, which led to stories about Winterberry Ridge's founding families. She found herself genuinely interested, mentally collecting details not for any fabricated travel blog, but because the town's quirky resilience appealed to something in her. How long do these storms usually last? She asked, pulling her blanket tighter. This one? Probably 3 more days, at least. Jack glanced at her. You in a rush to leave? The question seemed weighted somehow. No, she said after a pause. Not really. Another comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire. Piper was beginning to drift when Jack's voice, softer than she'd heard before, pulled her back. My grandmother used to say power outages were baking opportunities. She turned toward him, curious about this unprompted offering. When I was maybe 8, we lost power for nearly a week in a storm like this. Grandma Rose dragged me down to the bakery, just like tonight. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, transforming his face. She taught me to make hand pies by firelight, said even the dark can't stop Whitmores from baking. As he spoke about his grandmother, His hands moved expressively in the flickering light. Piper noticed how his voice changed when remembering her, the edges rounded off, warmth seeping through. This was the most he'd spoken at once since they'd met. "What kind of pie?" she asked. "Apple cranberry with rosemary." It was her favorite. He looked almost surprised at having shared this, as if the words had escaped without permission. Piper smiled. "That sounds amazing. I'd love to try," she caught herself. "I mean, I bet that would make a great feature for my blog. People back in the real world eat up these quaint small-town blackout stories." The moment the words left her mouth, she wished she could snatch them back. Jack's expression immediately shuddered, the openness of seconds ago replaced by that familiar wall. "Glad we can provide entertainment for the real world," he said, voice razor-sharp. Piper winced. "That came out wrong." "Did it?" His jaw tightened. "Or did you just say what you actually think?" She could have defended herself, argued semantics, or pretended to misunderstand his offense. Instead, she took a breath and met his eyes directly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That was thoughtless. And I didn't mean to trivialize your memory." Her simple apology seemed to catch him off guard. He studied her face as if searching for insincerity, but found none. After a moment, Piper asked, "Have you always lived in Winterberry Ridge? Besides culinary school, I mean?" The question was genuine, born of actual curiosity, rather than an attempt to smooth things over. Jack seemed to weigh his response. "Mostly. Did a summer in Providence, working at a hotel restaurant. Few months in Portland, helping a friend open a bistro." He poked at the fire again. "Always came back." "Because of your dad?" "At first," he admitted. "Then it just became where I belonged." He glanced at her. "Not everyone wants to live in a city, you know." "I know that," she said, drawing patterns on the blanket with her finger. "Cities can be exhausting." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. "Is that why you're doing this travel blog thing? Getting away from the exhaustion?" Piper's stomach knotted with guilt. She settled for a partial truth. "I needed a break. To see something different." "And Winterberry Ridge is different enough?" "More than you know," she said softly. The conversation gradually warmed again, moving to safer topics. Jack described his brief stint in culinary school, too many people more interested in being on cooking shows than actually cooking, and his father's recovery. Piper shared innocuous stories from her college days, carefully avoiding specifics about her current life. As they talked, the first hints of dawn appeared, a faint lightening of the darkness outside the windows. Their positions had shifted throughout the night, imperceptible adjustments bringing them closer together as they drifted in and out of sleep. Without fully realizing how it happened, Piper found her head resting against Jack's shoulder, his arm loosely draped around her. She awakened fully to pink light filtering through frosted windows. Jack was still asleep beside her, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The fire had burned down to embers, but she felt warmer than she had all night. In sleep, Jack's face transformed. The perpetual furrow between his brows had smoothed, and his mouth, usually set in a firm line, looked almost soft. Piper studied him with unguarded curiosity, the slight crookedness of his nose, broken once perhaps, the fan of his eyelashes against his cheeks, a small scar near his temple that she hadn't noticed before. Without his glower and sharp retorts, he looked younger, approachable. As the first rays of sunlight slanted across his face, Jack's eyes fluttered open, meeting hers at close range. For a suspended moment, neither moved. His gaze was clear and direct without its usual guardedness, and something unspoken passed between them in that brief window before full consciousness brought back their usual defenses. Piper felt a swooping sensation in her stomach. This was not the prickly baker who had reluctantly sheltered her. This was someone else entirely, someone whose eyes held unexpected depth and whose arm felt right around her shoulders. And that was absolutely, definitely a problem.
Chapter 4. Battle of the Crusts. Jack pressed his palm into the dough with more force than necessary, creating a satisfying thump against the wooden counter. He counted each fold silently, 12, 13, 14, maintaining the precise rhythm that had produced perfect crusts for nearly a decade. The morning light streamed through Frost and Crumb's windows, casting long shadows across the flour-dusted workspace as he tried desperately to lose himself in the familiar routine. Anything to avoid thinking about this morning. About waking up with Piper curled against him on the couch, her head tucked against his chest, one hand resting just above his heart. 21, 22, he muttered under his breath, pressing harder. And Mrs. Farnsworth says registration closes Friday, which means you have exactly 2 days to stop pretending you don't hear me. Jack looked up to find Evie standing opposite him, waving a vibrant blue flyer like a matador's cape. Her chestnut curls had already escaped her messy bun, creating a wild halo around her determined expression. "I hear you fine," he said, returning his attention to the dough. "I'm just not interested." 3 years, Jack. Evie planted herself directly in his line of sight. 3 years running you've skipped the Winterberry pie off, and I'm not covering for you this time. You don't need to cover for me. Jack folded the dough with mechanical precision. Just tell them I'm busy. With what? More important pie business. Evie's teasing tone sharpened. Your grandmother won this competition 5 times. It's basically a Whitmore family tradition. Jack's hands stilled for a moment before he resumed kneading with renewed vigor. Traditions change. The whole town expects. The whole town can expect whatever they want. Jack reached for more flour, dusting it perhaps too aggressively across his workspace. That doesn't obligate me to anything. He recognized the emotion burning beneath his annoyance, an uncomfortable flicker he refused to name. It wasn't fear. Jack Whitmore didn't fear baking competitions, especially not ones judged by Mrs. Farnsworth and the senior choir director. What if I told you they've changed the prize this year? Evie asked, her voice softening into the tone she used when coaxing skittish dogs and stubborn bakers. Winner gets first pick of holiday market stall locations. Jack snorted. You think I care where? A noise from the back room made him look up. Piper appeared in the doorway, her honey blonde hair hastily tied back, wisps escaping around her face. She wore one of his old aprons, the fabric swallowing her smaller frame, the ties wrapped twice around her waist. There was a smudge of flour on her right cheek, just below where her eyes crinkled when she smiled. Jack immediately dropped his gaze back to the dough, annoyed at his own distraction. 28. 29. 30 folds. Morning. Piper's voice carried an irritating amount of energy for someone who'd spent the night curled up on a too small couch. Please tell me there's coffee. Fresh pot by the register, Evie answered before Jack could grunt a response. Her expression brightened with sudden, suspicious enthusiasm. Piper, perfect timing. I was just telling Jack about our Winterberry pie off. Jack shot Evie a warning glare that she pretended not to notice. Pie off. Piper moved toward the coffee pot, navigating the unfamiliar kitchen with increasing confidence. Like a competition. Only the biggest baking event of the winter, Evie said, following Piper and handing her a chipped mug with flourish. Judges' prizes, heated rivalries that have caused at least 2 divorces and 1 decades-long feud between the Hendersons and the Millers. Jack watched with mounting horror as Piper's expression transformed from polite interest to that determined enthusiasm he was learning to dread. Her eyes widened slightly, that dimple he didn't want to notice appearing in her left cheek. That sounds amazing, Piper said, accepting the coffee. Is it open to the public? I'd love to include something like that in my blog. Absolutely open. Anyone can enter or attend, Evie explained, shooting Jack a triumphant look. It's been a town tradition since 1952. Jack's grandmother was a 3-time champion. Her blueberry lattice pie is still spoken about with reverence. Piper turned toward Jack with that look, the one that meant she was about to cause trouble. Wait, your grandmother was a champion and you bake for a living. Her eyebrows rose. So you're competing, right? No, Jack said flatly, returning to his dough with renewed focus. He hasn't entered in 3 years, Evie supplied helpfully, ignoring Jack's darkening expression. Piper approached the counter, coffee in hand. Why not? If you're so skilled. It's not worth my time, Jack cut her off, voice clipped. The steel in his tone would have deterred most Winterberry Ridge residents, but Piper Hart clearly wasn't most people. Instead of backing down, she tilted her head, something challenging flickering in her eyes. She took a slow sip of coffee, studying him over the rim of the mug. Or maybe you're afraid of losing. The bakery fell silent. Even Evie looked nervous at this direct provocation, glancing between them with wide eyes. Jack's hand stilled against the dough. Excuse me? I mean, baking techniques evolve, Piper continued, her tone conversational but undeniably provocative. Maybe modern bakers have methods your traditional approach can't match. Jack straightened to his full height, flour dusting his forearms. My traditional approach has sustained this bakery for 3 generations. And that's admirable, Piper nodded, her smile just a touch too innocent. Very historic. Historic, he repeated, the word tasting sour. I just meant. My grandmother's pie crust recipe, Jack interrupted, grabbing his pastry cutter with unexpected fervor, is scientifically calibrated to create the perfect balance of flaky and tender. He demonstrated the precise angle of his cut. Tighter lamination at the bottom for stability, lighter folding toward the edges for maximum flake. Piper stepped closer to observe, invading his carefully maintained workspace. The scent of her shampoo, something citrusy and unexpected, momentarily disrupted his concentration. Interesting, she said, leaning in to examine his technique. But I took this amazing corporate team-building cooking class in Chicago, and the chef said cold butter chunks are the secret. She recommended a quick chill technique where you? Jack's disbelieving scoff cut her off mid-sentence. A corporate team-building cooking class. It was very informative, Piper defended, chin lifting. The chef had worked in 3 different Michelin-starred restaurants. And now teaches executives to make pie crust between trust falls? You know what? Piper set down her coffee cup with purpose. I'll just show you. Before Jack could protest, she'd grabbed a clean section of counter and was gathering ingredients with determined efficiency. Flour, she narrated, measuring with more confidence than precision. Salt, sugar, where do you keep your butter? Bottom shelf of the walk-in, Jack answered automatically, then caught himself. Wait, you don't need to. I need to prove a point, Piper called over her shoulder as she disappeared into the refrigerator. She returned with butter and began cutting it into improbably large chunks. The trick is keeping everything ice cold. Jack watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as she assembled the ingredients with absolute conviction and questionable technique. You're using too much water, he pointed out as she poured liquid with abandon. The recipe is more of a guideline, Piper insisted, dragging sticky dough from the bowl onto the countertop. Baking is creative. Baking is chemistry, Jack countered, wincing as she began to knead the wet mixture like bread dough. You're developing too much gluten. I'm creating structure, Piper corrected, though her confidence was clearly wavering as the dough clung to her fingers in sticky clumps. She frowned, adding more flour that only partially helped. It just needs more kneading. Jack watched her struggle for another 30 seconds before his professional instincts overrode his desire to let her fail spectacularly. With a resigned sigh, he stepped behind her, his hands covering hers. Like this, he said, guiding her movements. Light pressure, quarter turn, fold. The sudden physical closeness startled them both. Jack became acutely aware of how his chest nearly touched her back, his arms framing hers as he demonstrated the proper motion. She fit against him with unsettling perfection, her head at just the right height to tuck under his chin. He cleared his throat and stepped back, ignoring the strange emptiness that followed. That should fix it. Piper looked down at the dough, then back at him, a smile tugging at her lips. So you're saying my corporate baking seminar led me astray? The tension broke, and Jack found himself fighting a smile. I'm saying your corporate baking seminar should stick to motivational cupcake decorating. Piper's laugh, genuine and unguarded, caught him off guard. That was actually part 2 of the workshop. I made a cupcake that said synergize in blue frosting. Inspiring, Jack deadpanned, surprising himself with the ease of their banter. Did it improve quarterly sales? Absolutely tanked them, Piper admitted, attempting to salvage her dough. But team morale was through the roof, for at least 17 minutes. Jack found himself responding to her teasing with increasingly playful retorts, until he caught sight of Evie's knowing smirk from across the kitchen. The reminder that they had an audience made him step back, both literally and figuratively. Anyway, he said, returning to his own properly executed dough, the pie-off isn't my thing anymore. Why not? Piper asked, the question softer than her previous challenges. Jack's hands slowed their methodical work. He could feel both women watching him, waiting. He rarely spoke about this, but something in Piper's expression, genuine curiosity without demand, loosened his usual reserve. After Gran passed, some traditions hurt too much to continue, he admitted, focusing on the dough rather than their faces. She loved the competition. Used to stay up all night perfecting new flavors, testing different techniques. He shrugged, aiming for casualness. Entering without her there just felt wrong. When he finally looked up, Piper's expression held understanding rather than pity. The distinction meant more than he wanted to admit. I get that, she said simply. Jack found himself uncharacteristically flustered, turning away to aggressively reorganize cooling racks that were already perfectly aligned. Something had shifted between them, and he wasn't entirely comfortable with the change. When their eyes met again, he blurted out, "You need proper training." What? Baking training, he clarified, not entirely sure where he was going with this. Just so you don't destroy my kitchen. If you're going to be here anyway, you might as well learn the right way. Evie's eyebrow rose so high it nearly disappeared beneath her curls, her smile knowing in a way that made Jack want to revoke her Christmas bonus. Really? Piper's entire face brightened. You teach me. Basic techniques only, Jack hedged, already questioning his impulsive offer. Nothing fancy. That would be amazing. I could include it in my blog, Small Town Secrets, Learning from a Master Baker. My readers will love the authentic local experience. Her enthusiasm should have been irritating. Instead, Jack found it oddly endearing, right until her words registered fully. The blog. Right. A sharp pang of reminder, she was just passing through, documenting their quaint little town before returning to her real life. This was content for her followers, not a genuine interest in his craft or his world. We'll start tomorrow morning, he said, his tone cooling slightly. 6 a.m. Don't be late. After closing, Jack found himself alone in the bakery, the evening silence broken only by the hum of refrigerators and the occasional settling creak of the old building. He stared down at the pie-off entry form on the counter, not entirely remembering when he'd picked it up, much less begun filling it out. His gaze drifted to the vintage photo on the wall, his grandmother standing proudly beside her award-winning pie, her smile wide beneath a crown of silver hair. She'd love that he was considering entering again. She'd also see right through his sudden change of heart. Jack's fingers traced the submission form, circling the blank space where he should write his entry category. 3 years he'd avoided this competition, and now he was contemplating returning because, what? Because a temporary visitor with big city notions about baking had challenged him? Because he wanted to prove something? He glanced at the counter where Piper had stood, the workspace now clean but for a light dusting of flour that caught the evening light. Teaching her to bake was a terrible idea. She was leaving as soon as the roads cleared. Getting attached to her enthusiasm, her questions, her genuine interest in his craft, that was a recipe for disappointment. Jack knew better than most that people from the real world always left Winterberry Ridge behind. They came, they observed, they departed, taking with them whatever pieces of himself he'd foolishly shared. He'd been down this road before, and the destination was always the same, an empty bakery and the bitter taste of having once again believed someone might actually stay. He stared at the entry form, wrestling with conflicting desires, keeping his emotional distance versus the uncomfortable realization that Piper Hart was beginning to matter to him. With a decisive exhale, Jack picked up his pen. He might regret this, But at least the pie-off would be over before the roads were clear enough for her to leave.
Chapter 5. Stirred, not shaken. Piper stared at her phone in the dim light of Jack's guest room. The screen glowed accusingly, showing 11:47 p.m., 3 missed calls from her boss, and a string of increasingly urgent emails about the Wilson account. Her thumb hovered over the notification, muscle memory nearly making the decision for her. Just checking in on that market research for the Wilson presentation. Your input would be greatly appreciated. That was Derek's way of saying, drop everything and do this now. 2 years as his marketing coordinator had taught her to decode his polite demands. The most recent message was far less subtle. Piper, the team needs this ASAP. Please confirm receipt. She sighed and set the phone face down on the nightstand. Even on what was supposed to be her emergency mental health break, work found her like a heat-seeking missile. She tugged the borrowed quilt tighter around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of cinnamon and something distinctly Jack, a clean outdoorsy scent she couldn't quite place. A soft creak from downstairs caught her attention, followed by the muffled sound of cabinet doors opening and closing. Piper glanced at her phone again. Nearly midnight. She thought Jack had gone to bed hours ago, right after their awkward goodnight in the hallway when they'd both reached for the bathroom door at the same time. She debated ignoring it and trying to sleep, but curiosity won out. Swinging her legs over the edge of the bed, she slipped her feet into the fuzzy socks Jack had grudgingly loaned her. My sister left them here, I don't wear pink anything, and wrapped herself in the flannel robe hanging on the back of the door. The old farmhouse floorboards protested as she crept downstairs, wincing at every squeak. The kitchen was empty but not dark. A strip of warm light peeked out from beneath the connecting door to the bakery. Piper approached quietly, pushing the door open just enough to peer through. Jack stood at the large center island, working in the dim light of a single overhead lamp. His movements were mesmerizing, confident and graceful, as he rolled out dough with practiced precision. His sleeves were pushed up to the elbows, revealing forearms dusted with flour. A strand of dark hair fell across his forehead as he leaned forward, completely absorbed in his craft. What struck her most was his expression. Gone was the perpetual furrow between his brows, the tight set of his jaw. Instead, his features had softened, relaxed in a way she'd never seen. He was humming, the low melody barely audible but undeniably content. This was Jack in his element, unguarded, at peace. Something about witnessing this private moment made Piper's chest tighten. She shifted her weight, and a floorboard groaned beneath her. Jack's head snapped up, their eyes meeting through the doorway. The spell broke instantly. Can't sleep? He asked, his tone carefully neutral as he straightened up. Piper pushed the door open fully, caught in the act. Sorry, I heard noises. I wasn't spying on you. Well, I guess technically I was, but not in a creepy way. Great, now she was rambling. Jack's mouth quirked slightly at one corner. I'm used to being the only one awake at this hour. What are you doing? She stepped into the bakery, hugging the robe closer against the slight chill. Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd get some practice in for the festival. He gestured to the half-formed pie in front of him. Since someone volunteered me. You're still mad about that? Piper approached the island, keeping a cautious distance. You know you wanted to enter anyway. Jack shrugged, neither confirming nor denying. You can watch if you want. The invitation was reluctant, but not entirely unfriendly. Just don't touch anything. In the quiet of midnight, the bakery felt different, intimate and almost magical. Piper noticed details she'd missed in daylight. Vintage photographs hanging on the faded blue walls, many featuring winning pies held by beaming bakers. One caught her eye, a woman with Jack's steel blue eyes holding a certificate dated 1987. Is that your mom? She asked, pointing to the photo. Jack glanced up, his hand still working the dough. Grandmother. 4-time champion of the Winterberry pie-off. 4 times? That's impressive. Would have been more if she hadn't let my grandfather win twice. A ghost of a smile played on his lips. She said his ego needed it more than she needed the trophy. Piper moved slowly around the perimeter of the kitchen, taking in more details: framed handwritten recipes with yellowed edges, scorch marks on the ancient wooden counters, a collection of rolling pins hanging on the wall. Outside, snow fell gently, visible through windows that reflected their movements like mirrors against the darkness. "This place has history," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Since 1932. My great-grandfather opened it, after losing his banking job in the Depression." "So you're a fourth-generation baker?" "Third, who actually runs the place. My father was an accountant." Jack reached for a knife and began cutting the rolled dough into even strips. "He married into the family business, but never wanted to take it over." Piper moved closer, watching his hands. "But you did." "Someone had to." He arranged the strips with methodical care. "My grandmother taught me everything she knew before the arthritis got too bad. Said I had the touch." His voice softened on the last words. "Can I see how you do that?" Piper asked, gesturing to the lattice he was creating. Jack hesitated, then nodded. "This was my grandmother's technique." He demonstrated the weaving pattern, his fingers surprisingly delicate for their size. "Most people start from the center, but she always worked from one edge to the other. Said it created better tension." Piper leaned in, watching closely. Their shoulders brushed, and neither moved away. She was suddenly very aware of his proximity, the faint scent of cinnamon that clung to him, the controlled strength in his flour-dusted hands, the way his voice dropped lower when sharing something personal. "It's like textile work," she observed, fascinated by the pattern taking shape. "Exactly. Grandmother used to say pie making was just fabric work with food." He crimped the edges with a practiced pinch of his fingers. "My grandfather called her pies edible quilts." Piper smiled at that. Their faces were close enough that she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the surprising length of his eyelashes as he focused on his work. "So," Jack said, not looking up, "what has you wandering around at midnight? Your travel blog keeping you up?" The question caught her off guard, a pointed reminder of her lie. Guilt pricked at her. "Just insomnia, I guess." The half-truth felt hollow as it left her lips. "I have trouble turning my brain off sometimes." Jack's eyes flicked up, studying her face with that penetrating look that made her feel like he could see right through her carefully constructed facade. "Something specific keeping you awake?" For a moment, Piper nearly told him the truth, about the mounting pressure at work, the panic attacks she'd started having in the office bathroom, how she'd impulsively fled the city when her boss had suggested she might not be committed enough to earn her promotion. Instead, she reached out impulsively and grabbed a handful of flour from the counter. "Actually, I was thinking I should try my hand at this lattice thing. Show you city folks have skills too." Jack's eyebrow rose skeptically, but he stepped back, crossing flour-dusted arms across his chest. "Be my guest. I could use the entertainment. Your confidence in me is overwhelming." Piper positioned herself in front of the half-finished pie, attempting to mimic his earlier movements. The dough felt more delicate than it looked, breaking between her fingers as she tried to weave the strips. "Lighter touch," Jack instructed from behind her. "You're handling it like you're trying to subdue it." "I am extremely gentle," she protested as another strip broke. Jack snorted. "Like a bulldozer is gentle." Piper's strips kept breaking, the edges uneven, and when she tried to position one across the center, it slipped from her fingers and plopped directly into the filling, splattering both of them with tiny droplets of blueberry. "Oh no," she yelped, then bit her lip, looking up at Jack with a wince. To her surprise, instead of irritation, his face cracked into a genuine laugh, deep and rich, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The sound was so unexpected it momentarily left her speechless. "I've never seen anyone sabotage a pie quite so efficiently," he said, his voice warm with amusement. "I prefer to think of it as creative reinterpretation." She wiped at a spot of filling on her cheek, succeeding only in smearing it further. Jack shook his head, still smiling. "Let's salvage what we can." He moved beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers as he reached for a clean section of dough. Their hands worked in tandem, Jack guiding rather than commanding. Piper found herself leaning into his instructions, surrendering her usual need to prove herself. There was something soothing about the rhythm they fell into, him demonstrating, her following, their movements gradually synchronizing into a wordless dance around the kitchen counter. Not terrible, Jack conceded as they finished repairing her disaster pie, his shoulder pressed warm against hers as they both leaned over their creation. High praise from the pie master. Piper turned her head to smile at him, suddenly aware of how close their faces were. Jack was taking the whole thing too seriously, his brow furrowing as he meticulously crimped the edge. Without thinking, Piper reached out and dabbed a small spot of flour on the tip of his nose. He froze, looking up in stunned disbelief. A few days ago, that expression might have intimidated her, but now she recognized the spark in his eyes. It wasn't anger, it was challenge. With deliberate slowness, Jack reached into the flour bin and brushed his fingers across her cheek, leaving a streak of white powder. "You really want to start this?" Their eyes locked, and something electric passed between them. "Maybe I do," Piper whispered, her heart suddenly racing. What happened next was a blur. Piper grabbed another handful of flour. Jack retaliated with methodical precision that quickly deteriorated into childish chaos. She ducked behind the island as he lobbed a well-aimed puff that exploded against the wall behind her. His tactical approach was no match for her guerrilla warfare, as she circled around and caught him from behind, dumping flour down the neck of his shirt. "You fight dirty, heart," he accused, spinning around to catch her wrist before she could retreat. "All's fair in flour and war," she quipped, twisting away with a laugh. The stuffy, serious baker she'd first met was nowhere to be found. In his place was a man who ducked behind counters and launched sneak attacks, his rare, uninhibited smile hitting her harder than any flour bomb. Piper felt something unfamiliar expanding in her chest as she watched him abandon control, his entire demeanor transformed by play. "Surrender now," Jack called, advancing on her with a dangerous amount of flour cupped in his palms. "Never." Piper backpedaled, slipping slightly on the powder-covered floor. She grabbed a nearby sifter as a shield. Jack lunged forward just as she tried to dodge, her sock-covered feet sliding on the slick floor. She felt herself falling, a small yelp escaping her lips, but instead of hitting the ground, strong hands caught her around the waist, pulling her firmly against a solid chest. Time seemed to suspend as they froze in the embrace. Both were covered in white powder, breathing heavily from laughter and exertion. Jack's hands remained steady on her waist, warm even through the flannel robe. Piper's palms rested against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her fingers. Slowly, she looked up. Flour dusted his dark hair and eyelashes, giving him an almost otherworldly appearance in the dim light. His eyes, usually so guarded, were open and vulnerable, as they dropped to her lips with unmistakable intent. Piper couldn't have moved if she wanted to. Her breath caught as Jack lowered his head with excruciating slowness, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She tilted her face upward instead, eyes fluttering closed as the space between them narrowed to nothing. A sharp knock at the bakery's front door shattered the moment like glass. They sprang apart as if burned, Jack's hands dropping from her waist as Piper stumbled back a step. Through the darkness, Mrs. Farnsworth's silhouette was visible against the glass door, her voice carrying clearly, "Jackson Whitmore, is that you with the lights on past midnight?" Jack ran a hand through his flour-covered hair, leaving it standing on end. "I should," he gestured vaguely toward the door. "Yeah, of course," Piper nodded too quickly, wrapping her arms around herself. While Jack went to deal with Mrs. Farnsworth, Piper caught her reflection in the curved surface of a stainless steel mixing bowl. Hair wild, face smeared with flour, cheeks flushed, and eyes bright with an emotion that terrified her. She'd known Jack Whitmore for less than a week. How had he managed to crack open something in her that years of dating in the city hadn't touched? She mentally calculated how many days until the roads would clear, how long until she needed to return to her real life with its deadlines and promotions and carefully mapped 5-year plan. The realization hit her with surprising force. Winterberry Ridge, and particularly its grumpy baker, was starting to feel more authentic than the career she'd spent years building. From the front of the shop, she could hear Jack's low voice explaining something to Mrs. Farnsworth, whose responses were clipped but somehow knowing. Piper began half-heartedly gathering scattered flour into piles, more to occupy her hands than to actually help clean. When Jack returned, his expression was carefully neutral. Mrs. Farnsworth saw the lights and thought someone might be breaking in. At midnight? In a bakery? In Winterberry Ridge? Piper asked, trying for lightness. The Great Pie Heist of 2018 is still fresh in everyone's minds, Jack said with a perfectly straight face. Piper laughed despite herself. You're joking. Someone stole 4 pies from the festival judging table. National tragedy. They fell into cleaning up side by side, maintaining careful distance while stealing glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. The almost kiss hung between them, unacknowledged but impossible to forget. When the floor was finally clear and the midnight pie safely stored, they stood awkwardly in the connecting doorway between bakery and house. Well, Jack said, rubbing the back of his neck. It's late. Very late, Piper agreed, looking everywhere but at his face. We should. Yeah. They headed upstairs in silence, pausing at the bathroom door in an awkward dance of you first gestures. When they finally parted in the hallway with mumbled goodnights, Piper slipped into the guest room and leaned against the closed door, her heart still racing. Her phone glowed on the nightstand, another email notification. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the immediate urge to check it. Instead, she made her decision. She would stay through the festival, telling herself it was to help Jack win, knowing deep down it was because she wasn't ready to leave whatever this was becoming. The Wilson account, her promotion, the carefully constructed life waiting for her. None of it seemed as important as discovering what might have happened if Mrs. Farnsworth hadn't knocked. Tomorrow, she'd figure out how to extend her stay without raising suspicion. For tonight, she'd allow herself to fall asleep with flour still dusting her hair, and the lingering warmth of Jack's almost kiss on her lips.
Chapter 6. Flakes and Fault Lines. Jack woke with a start, disoriented for a moment before identifying the sound that had yanked him from sleep. A sharp, splintering crack followed by the groan of straining wood. Even half-conscious, something in that sound sent a jolt of dread straight through him. He was at the window in 3 strides, squinting through the pre-dawn darkness at Frost and Crumb across the street. The wind howled with unusual ferocity, whipping snow into miniature cyclones, and there, illuminated in the glow of the street lamp, hung the bakery's sign, partially torn from its moorings. The hand-carved wooden board that had welcomed customers for 40 years, now dangled precariously by a single bracket, swinging violently with each gust. "Damn it," Jack muttered, already grabbing for clothes. The physical ache that bloomed in his chest was disproportionate to a mere sign, and he knew exactly why. One more piece of his family legacy he couldn't protect, one more thread connecting him to his grandfather fraying before his eyes. He yanked on jeans and boots without bothering to lace them, pulled a heavy sweater over his head and was down the stairs in seconds. The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow as he shoved open his front door, but he barely registered it. The snow had piled even higher overnight, reaching past his knees in places as he forced his way through the drifts. Wind-driven ice particles stung his exposed face as he approached the bakery, keys already in hand. The sign's creaking sounded almost like a cry for help. His grandfather had spent an entire summer crafting that sign, carving the intricate snowflake border by hand, carefully painting the flowing script of Frost and Crumb with painstaking precision. Jack's numb fingers fumbled with the lock before the door finally gave way. He grabbed a coil of rope from the supply closet and a stepladder from the back, then braced himself before plunging back into the storm. The streets remained deserted. Sensible people were still asleep at this hour, as he positioned the ladder beneath the sign, trying to ignore how the wind threatened to topple him with each step up. The rope felt rough against his already raw hands as he attempted to secure the dangling end of the sign, cursing under his breath when a particularly vicious gust nearly ripped it from his grasp. The wooden board was heavier than it looked, waterlogged from years of winter storms despite regular maintenance. "Need a hand?" The unexpected voice nearly sent him tumbling backward off the ladder. He looked down to find Piper standing below, snow dusting her hair, wearing what he recognized as his spare winter coat, the one that hung by his back door. The sleeves extended well past her fingertips, and the hem reached almost to her knees. "What are you doing out here?" he called over the wind. Instead of answering, she climbed up the first 2 steps of the ladder, bracing it with her weight. "Tell me what you need me to do." Jack wanted to ask how she'd heard, why she'd followed, but the sign chose that moment to groan ominously. "Hold the other end steady while I secure this side," he shouted, surprised when she followed his instruction without question or comment. Her small hands gripped the edge of the wooden sign, steadying it against the wind's assault. They worked in focused silence, Jack looping the rope through the existing brackets, creating a temporary harness until proper repairs could be made. Despite the awkward angle and the freezing temperature numbing his fingers, he found a strange rhythm working with her, adjusting when she adjusted, anticipating each other's movements without needing to speak. 20 minutes later, the sign hung securely, if inelegantly, in its rightful place. Jack's breath came in visible clouds as he descended the ladder, his split and bleeding knuckles barely registering through the cold. "Let's get inside," he said, not waiting for her response as he gathered their makeshift rescue equipment. Piper followed without argument, which struck him as unusual enough to notice. The warmth of the bakery enveloped them, as Jack locked the door behind them. Only now did he realize how thoroughly frozen he'd become, violent shivers racking his body as circulation returned to his extremities. He flicked on the lights, illuminating the familiar space that somehow looked different with Piper standing in it at this early hour, as if she'd crossed some invisible boundary between visitor and something else he couldn't name. Jack moved to the back room, returning with the first aid kit. The split across his knuckles had begun to sting fiercely as his hands thawed. He sat heavily at one of the small tables, pulling a bottle of antiseptic from the kit. "I'll do that," Piper said, not exactly asking permission as she took the bottle from his hands. She pulled up a chair, turning his palm upward to examine the damage. Jack stared past her at the window, where the secured sign was just visible through the still falling snow. "The whole border's cracked. The snowflake pattern my grandfather carved is fractured in at least 3 places." He hadn't meant to say it aloud, certainly hadn't intended the note of loss that crept into his voice. Piper's touch was surprisingly gentle as she cleaned the cut. "Is that why you flew out there like the building was on fire? Because your grandfather made it?" Jack didn't answer immediately. The sign was just the latest in a long list of things he was desperately trying to preserve: the bakery, the recipes, the traditions his family had built. Each small loss felt like a personal failure. "The paint's peeling too," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Special weather-resistant formula that doesn't even exist anymore. And the bracket." "I used to restore furniture with my dad," Piper interrupted, applying antibiotic ointment to his hand. "When I was younger. Old pieces, antiques mostly. I could help." The automatic refusal formed instantly on his tongue. This wasn't just another task to delegate. The sign represented permanence, continuity, everything Piper wasn't. She was passing through, a temporary blip in Winterberry Ridge's timeless rhythm. Having her help fix something that symbolized lasting commitment seemed wrong somehow. But when he glanced up, the words died unspoken. There was nothing of pity in her expression, none of that big city condescension he'd braced for. Instead, he saw quiet understanding, as if she instinctively grasped what objects like this signified beyond their practical function. "I'm not talking about taking over," she added, misinterpreting his silence. "Just an extra pair of hands. Sometimes it's easier with 2 people." Against his better judgment, Jack found himself nodding. "We'd need to bring it inside first. Dry it out before we can properly assess the damage." "After breakfast," Piper said firmly, wrapping a bandage around his knuckles. "You're still half frozen, and I'm guessing your normal opening routine doesn't wait for sign disasters." Jack glanced at the clock, almost 5:30. Despite everything, his internal schedule remained stubbornly intact. The morning batches needed to be ready by 6:30, whether windstorms or mysterious city women disrupted his life or not. "Fine," he conceded. "After the morning rush." They worked in the back room of the bakery, tools spread across a cleared workbench. Jack had carefully removed the sign once the morning crowd had thinned, carrying it reverently inside like a wounded friend. Up close, the damage was even worse than he'd feared. 40 years of harsh Winterberry Ridge winters had taken their toll beneath the seemingly solid exterior. Jack watched with reluctant fascination as Piper confidently handled his grandfather's woodworking tools. Her corporate polished nails seemed strangely incongruous against sandpaper and wood glue. Yet she worked with unexpected precision, examining the fractures with a practiced eye. "We'll need to reinforce these joints," she murmured, fingers tracing the split in the wood. "And consolidate these areas before attempting any refinishing. What kind of sealant has been used on this historically?" The technical question caught him off guard. He'd expected polite interest at best, incompetence at worst. "Marine-grade polyurethane. My grandfather was obsessive about waterproofing." "Smart man. We should stick with that." Piper looked up. "What about the original carving technique for those damaged snowflakes? Do you know how he created that texture?" Jack found himself answering more openly than intended. He used a custom gouge he made himself. "I still have his tools." He hesitated before adding, "He taught me some basics when I was a kid. Nothing fancy." "Show me," Piper asked, holding out a small piece of scrap wood. "So I don't mess up the restoration." Without thinking, Jack moved behind her, his chest nearly touching her back as he guided her hands through the motion. "You need to hold it at this angle," he demonstrated, his larger hand covering hers on the tool. "Follow the grain, not against it." The position mirrored their flower fight from days ago, but without playfulness as a buffer, the intimacy felt raw and unfiltered. Jack became acutely aware of her, the faint freckles at her nape visible now that her hair was pulled up, the subtle floral scent that somehow cut through the wood polish and sawdust. He fought the sudden, inexplicable urge to trace those freckles with his fingertip. Piper turned slightly to ask a question, her face suddenly inches from his. "Like this," she murmured, eyes meeting his with an intensity that stole his breath. Jack stepped away abruptly, dropping a chisel with a clatter. "Yeah. That's it." His voice sounded strained even to his own ears. "Just practice on the scrap first." They settled into focused work, the silence stretching between them. Jack initially expected it to feel awkward, but instead found a surprising comfort in their shared concentration. Occasionally, their eyes would meet over a successful repair, small smiles exchanged without words when something went right. The easy rhythm of compatible people working together. The realization unsettled him deeply. This was exactly what he'd been avoiding, this dangerous sense of partnership, of fitting together. He deliberately fumbled a measurement, needing to disrupt the harmony that threatened to pull him further into her orbit. "Damn it," he muttered with exaggerated frustration. "Everything okay?" Piper asked, looking up from the section of border she was carefully repairing. Jack nodded curtly, reaching for his coffee mug instead of answering. As he took a sip, Piper's gaze fell on the sign's intricate border. "What's the story behind the snowflake pattern?" she asked, fingers hovering reverently above the delicate carving. "It's beautiful." Jack startled himself by answering truthfully. "My grandfather called it winter's promise. He said snowflakes were nature's reminder that beauty always follows harshness if you're patient enough to wait." His voice grew uncharacteristically soft. "He taught me to carve during summer afternoons. Said working with wood was a lesson in patience. You can't rush it, can't force it to be something it's not meant to be." "He sounds like a wise man," Piper said. He was. Jack ran his thumb along a worn section of the wood. "When I was 10, he let me carve one of these snowflakes. Took me 3 attempts to get it right. It's this one, actually." He pointed to a slightly asymmetrical flake near the bottom corner. "You never fixed it, made it perfect?" Piper asked. Jack shook his head. "He wouldn't let me. Said imperfection was how people knew something was made with human hands and heart." "My father said something similar," Piper replied, surprising him. "Called it the mark of the maker. He restored antiques for rich clients who wanted pieces to look authentic, but perfect. Dad always left one small, deliberate flaw, said it was dishonest to erase all evidence of time and human touch." Jack studied her, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the polished city professional who'd crashed into his life. Didn't expect that from a corporate marketing type. Piper's hand stilled. You know, we're not all soulless automatons in the corporate world. Didn't say you were. Jack picked up a fine-grained sandpaper, focusing intently on smoothing a rough edge. Just surprised. Seems like a long way from furniture restoration to whatever it is you actually do. He hadn't meant to emphasize the last part, hadn't intended to highlight his lingering doubt about her travel blogger story. The words just slipped out. Piper was quiet for so long that Jack finally looked up. Something in her expression made him regret the implicit accusation. I went to culinary school, he said suddenly, not entirely sure why he was offering this information. In Boston. Had plans to work at some high-end restaurant with a celebrity chef attached. What happened? Piper asked softly. Jack's jaw tightened. My dad had his first heart attack. I came back to help, temporarily, I thought. Then I met someone who made staying seem like the right choice. He focused carefully on the wood grain. She called Winterberry Ridge suffocating eventually. Said it was a place people escape from, not return to. Left for Chicago 2 years ago. The admission hung in the air between them. Jack immediately regretted it. He never discussed Melissa with anyone, certainly not with near strangers who would be leaving the moment roads cleared. But Piper's response wasn't the expected pity. I had 3 panic attacks in the week before my car slid off your road, she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. Full-blown, can't breathe, world closing in panic attacks. I told my boss I needed a personal day, and instead of asking if I was okay, she sent me 47 emails about an upcoming product launch. The confession felt weighted, significant, the first genuine piece of herself she'd offered without the travel blogger veneer. Is that why you're really here? Running away? Jack asked, gentler than he'd intended. Piper's smile was brittle. I wasn't running away. I was taking a strategic retreat. She traced a finger along the wood grain. At least that's what I told myself. Truth is, I couldn't remember the last time I felt like myself instead of some corporate performance version of me. Their eyes met briefly, and Jack saw something vulnerable there that resonated uncomfortably with his own careful defenses. Before he could respond, the timer he'd set earlier buzzed loudly. Afternoon prep, he said, grateful for the interruption. We should get this ready to rehang anyway. They worked in tandem to carefully move the restored sign, and Jack noticed how naturally Piper had integrated into his space, anticipating his movements, matching his pace, understanding his sparse communication style. When he needed a tool, she passed it before he asked. When he stepped left, she automatically moved right to balance their hold on the sign. The realization terrified him. When their hands brushed as they lifted the sign together, he found himself not pulling away immediately, allowing the contact to linger until Piper met his eyes with a question he was absolutely not ready to answer. Outside, the wind had finally calmed, though snow continued to fall in fat, lazy flakes. They positioned the ladder, and Jack climbed up to rehang the sign, newly reinforced brackets secure in his tool belt. Piper stood below, stabilizing the ladder as he worked. The silence between them felt charged now, heavy with unspoken things. When he descended, they stood together in the falling snow, admiring their handiwork. The newly restored sign gleamed between them, the intricate snowflakes standing out crisp and clear against the freshly sealed wood. Without conscious decision, Jack found himself stepping closer to her, drawn by something more powerful than his usual caution. A snowflake landed on Piper's cheek, and his hand rose of its own accord to brush it away. His fingers lingered against her skin, unable to break the contact. Her eyes widened, lips parting slightly as she leaned imperceptibly toward him. The moment stretched, crystallizing like the snow around them. Jack could feel his heartbeat in his fingertips where they touched her face, could see the question forming in her eyes, the slight catch of her breath that mirrored his own. She'll leave when the road's clear. The thought hit him like ice water. Jack stepped back abruptly, dropping his hand. I should check the mounting brackets again, he muttered, deliberately avoiding Piper's expression of confused hurt. Make sure everything's secure. He turned back to the sign, making unnecessary adjustments to hardware that was already perfectly aligned. Behind him, he heard the soft crunch of snow as Piper shifted her weight. "I'll head back in and start cleaning up the workbench," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Thanks," Jack replied, not turning around, not trusting himself to look at her. The calculation felt brutal but necessary. Piper would leave when the roads cleared, that was inevitable, and he could either guard himself now or break later. He'd already made that mistake once, letting someone become essential who saw Winterberry Ridge as temporary. He wouldn't survive making it twice. Jack stole a glance as Piper walked back toward the bakery, snow falling between them, like the distance he was forcing himself to maintain, even as everything in him wanted to close it.
Chapter 7. The Frosted Whisk. Piper teetered on the top rung of the ladder, her fingertips stretching toward the ceiling beam. She secured one end of the translucent fishing line, letting the paper snowflake dangle at precisely the right height. One down, approximately 5,000 to go. "Don't die up there," Jack had muttered before disappearing into the storage room. "The paperwork would be terrible." "Your concern is heartwarming," she'd called after him, unable to resist smiling. That was their rhythm now. His grouchiness no longer had any real bite, and her quick responses came automatically. As she descended a few rungs to adjust her position, Piper glanced through the frost-edged windows of the bakery. Outside, Winterberry Ridge was transforming before her eyes. The town square bustled with activity. Men in thick coats balanced on ladders, stringing twinkling lights between lampposts. Shop owners hung wreaths on doors, their breath clouding in the crisp air. A group of volunteers erected an enormous pine tree at the center of the square, debating the perfect angle with the solemnity of surgeons. Most charming of all were the children building snowmen along the sidewalk, carefully positioning tiny baker's hats on their frozen heads, a tribute to Frost and Crumb, she realized. One little girl was even attempting to fashion a rolling pin out of packed snow. Something tugged inside Piper's chest as she watched, a strange hollow ache she couldn't immediately identify. She'd visited picturesque towns before, had documented countless local traditions for work presentations, but always as an outsider looking in, capturing content before moving on. This was different. She was watching a place she knew coming alive with celebration. She recognized Mrs. Foster hanging garland outside her bookshop, knew that Ted from the hardware store always insisted on climbing the tallest ladder despite his wife's protests. She'd learned their coffee orders, their gossip, their inside jokes. The peculiar ache intensified as Piper recognized it for what it was, longing for something she'd never really had. A sense of belonging to a place, not just passing through. The bell above the door jingled, snapping her from her thoughts. Mrs. Farnsworth swept in, a flurry of expensive wool coat and purpose, followed by 4 elderly women Piper recognized as her unofficial council of advisors. Their animated conversation stopped abruptly at the sight of Piper perched on the ladder. "Well, good morning, dear," Mrs. Farnsworth called, her voice carrying that particular tone of exaggerated pleasantry that made Piper instantly suspicious. "Those snowflakes look absolutely marvelous." "Thank you," Piper replied, descending the ladder. "I'm trying to make sure they catch the light from the windows." "Aren't you thoughtful?" cooed one of the women, Meredith. Margaret, with a smile that felt like an examination. The group settled at their usual table near the counter, removing scarves and gloves with practiced synchronicity. Piper felt their gazes following her as she moved to hang the next decoration. "Have you settled on your weekend plans yet, Piper?" Mrs. Farnsworth asked, voice projecting across the bakery with theatrical casualness. "Now that you and Jack have been spending so much time together." Piper's foot slipped on the rung. She clutched the sides of the ladder to steady herself, feeling heat rush to her face. "Oh, careful there," one of the women called. "I'm just helping with festival preparations," Piper answered carefully, pretending intense focus on the snowflake in her hands. "Jack's been kind enough to let me stay until the road's clear." Mrs. Farnsworth exchanged knowing glances with her companions. "Kind, yes. That's certainly one word for it." Before Piper could decode that comment, salvation arrived in the form of Evie bursting through the kitchen doors, flour dusting her cheeks. "Piper! Thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed with such conviction that Piper momentarily believed she was actually needed. "I desperately need help with the festival preparations in the kitchen. Like right now." "Of course," Piper said, climbing down quickly.
"Ladies, if you'll excuse me."
She felt their eyes on her back as she escaped into the kitchen, the low murmur of their conversation resuming the moment the door swung shut behind her. "You're welcome," Evie whispered with a conspiratorial wink, guiding Piper toward a flour-dusted workspace. "Mrs. F. and the Golden Girls were about to put you through their full interrogation. I've been there. It's like a police lineup but with more questions about your future children." "My future what?" Piper squeaked. "Relax. They do this to everyone under 35 who's single." Evie slid a ball of dough toward her. "Here, make yourself useful. We need to roll these out for mini pies." Piper took the rolling pin, grateful for the distraction. Is the festival really this big of a deal? Everyone's acting like the royal family is coming to visit. "Bigger," Evie said seriously, dabbing flour on her nose as she brushed hair from her face. "Winter Festival Week is our thing. Tourists come from 3 counties over. We've been mentioned in regional magazines." "Impressive," Piper said, working the rolling pin back and forth. The dough was cool and smooth beneath her hands. Evie leaned in, lowering her voice. "Just so you know, this whole matchmaking committee thing." "The what now?" "Unofficial Town Matchmaking Committee. Mrs. Farnsworth is the ringleader, but half the senior citizens are in on it." Evie gestured toward the front of the bakery with her elbow. "It's their winter sport. And they've clearly set their sights on you and Jack." Piper laughed, though it came out slightly higher pitched than intended. "That's ridiculous." "Is it though?" Evie handed her a circular cutter. "You're living in his house, working in his bakery, and yesterday I caught him watching you for a full 3 minutes while you were restocking muffins. He was probably making sure I didn't mess up his precious display system," Piper muttered, focusing intently on cutting perfect circles from the dough. She noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Evie studied her with knowing eyes, a small smile playing at her lips. "They're not usually wrong, you know." "Who?" "The committee." Evie shrugged. "Last 5 couples they targeted are married now. One even named their baby after Mrs. Farnsworth." "That poor child," Piper said, earning a snort of laughter from Evie. They worked in companionable silence for a while, Piper grateful that the conversation had moved on. But as the mini pies went into the oven, Evie pointed toward the storage room. "We should probably start unpacking the festival decorations," she suggested. "Jack's been putting it off because he says they're aggressively festive." The storage room was organized chaos, clearly Jack's domain, with everything labeled but crammed into every available space. Together, they pulled out boxes marked "Festival" in Jack's precise handwriting. Buried beneath garlands and strings of lights, Piper discovered a weathered box labeled "Frosted Whisks." Her curiosity piqued. She lifted the lid to reveal dozens of ornately decorated whisks with colored ribbons attached. "What are these?" she asked, lifting one adorned with blue ribbon and tiny silver bells. Evie gasped in delight, rushing over. "You found them. I've been bugging Jack to dig these out." She took the whisk, admiring it. "Come on, these need to go out front. Everyone will be asking for them." Confused but intrigued, Piper followed Evie back to the main bakery, carrying the box. Several customers turned at their entrance, and Evie held up the whisk triumphantly. "Look what we found, everyone!" The reaction was immediate, exclamations of delight, customers abandoning their coffees to crowd around. "What's happening?" Piper whispered, setting the box on the counter. Evie's eyes sparkled. "Only Winterberry Ridge's oldest tradition. During the first snow of Festival Week, single townspeople toss decorated whisks into the fresh snow. It supposedly reveals your true love by how the whisk lands and who finds it." "That's specific," Piper said, examining another whisk with red ribbon and tiny wooden hearts. It started with the original baker in town, Jack's great-grandfather, Evie explained, voice rising as more customers gathered around. He was in love with the schoolteacher, but too shy to tell her. Legend says he accidentally dropped his whisk in the snow while walking home, and it landed pointing directly at her cottage. He took it as a sign to finally declare his love. And now everyone throws kitchen utensils in the snow? Piper raised an eyebrow, unable to keep the amusement from her voice. Not just any utensil, Mrs. Farnsworth interjected, approaching the counter with regal authority. The whisk symbolizes blending two lives together. She fixed Piper with a meaningful look. And no Whitmore has ever tossed a whisk and ended up alone. It's in their blood. Piper felt a strange flutter in her stomach at the implication. My parents met because of the whisk toss, Evie said dreamily. Mom's landed, pointing at the fire station, and Dad was the newest volunteer firefighter. My Charlie found mine stuck in a hedge by the church, added a gray-haired woman. We were married 52 years before he passed. Another customer joined in. My son met his wife when her whisk hit him in the head. Concussion and 7 stitches, but they've been happy for 15 years. Before Piper knew it, the entire bakery had erupted in whisk stories, each more coincidental and romantic than the last. She listened with amused skepticism, but something about their absolute conviction was charming. These people genuinely believed in their tradition, and their joy was infectious. We should create a display, Evie declared, already arranging whisks on the counter. First snow could come any day now. As if summoned by her words, someone near the window called out, "It's starting." Heads turned to see thick, perfect snowflakes beginning to fall outside, the kind that seemed designed for picture postcards. The bakery buzzed with immediate excitement. "Festival snow," someone exclaimed. "Quick, the whisks," called another. Customers rushed to grab whisks from Evie's hastily arranged display, pressing bills into her hand and hurrying outside. Within minutes, half the box was empty. "Aren't you going to get one?" Mrs. Farnsworth asked Piper, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Oh, I'm not," Piper began. "She's documenting the tradition for her travel blog," Evie interjected smoothly. "Right, Piper?" Caught between her ongoing lie about being a travel blogger and the expectant faces surrounding her, Piper felt herself nodding. "Right. Yes. Absolutely." "You can't just document it," an elderly man insisted. "You have to participate. It's good luck for visitors." "I wouldn't want to take someone else's whisk," Piper tried. "Nonsense," Mrs. Farnsworth declared, selecting an elegantly decorated whisk with cream-colored ribbon and pressing it into Piper's hands. "This one seems right for you." Swept up in the contagious enthusiasm and wanting to embrace local customs, at least outwardly, Piper found herself holding the whisk aloft. "Well, when in Winterberry Ridge," she announced with theatrical flair. The crowd cheered, and somehow Piper found herself being ushered toward the door, coatless but carried by the momentum of excitement. Outside, the snow was falling faster now, already forming a pristine white blanket over the sidewalks. A small crowd had gathered, townspeople laughing as they prepared to toss their whisks. "Stand over here," Evie guided her to a spot with particularly fresh snow. "You want a clean landing." "I can't believe I'm doing this," Piper muttered, but she was smiling. There was something freeing about participating in such innocent silliness. "On 3, someone called, and the crowd counted down together. Piper struck an exaggerated pose, playing up her participation as the travel blogger documenting quaint small-town traditions. With dramatic flair, she drew her arm back and tossed the whisk into the pristine snowbank. Precisely as Jack rounded the corner, arms laden with paper bags of supplies for tomorrow's baking. Their eyes locked in the instant the whisk left her fingers. Time seemed to slow as it arced through the air, trailing cream ribbon like a comet's tail, before disappearing into the snow with a soft piff. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps, meaningful looks, and excited murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Mrs. Farnsworth's triumphant "well" cut through the commotion like a knife through butter. Jack stood frozen, confusion shifting to understanding on his face as he took in the scene. Something unreadable flickered in his expression: surprise, followed by something softer that made Piper's heart stumble in its rhythm. "Jack should look for where it landed," someone shouted enthusiastically. "Tradition says the first person to spot it after the thrower is part of the magic," added another. Piper contemplated diving headfirst into the nearest snowbank. Instead, she managed an awkward wave. "Just, participating in local traditions. For my blog." Jack's mouth twisted in what might have been amusement. "Clearly," he said, shifting his grocery bags. "I need to get these inside." As he walked past her toward the bakery door, Piper caught the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The next hour passed in a blur of customers sharing their whisk success stories while ordering coffee and pastries. Piper retreated to the supply closet at the first opportunity, ostensibly to organize sprinkles, but actually trying to regulate her breathing. "Hiding?" Evie's voice made her jump. Jack's assistant slipped into the closet, closing the door partially behind her. "Inventory," Piper lied, gesturing vaguely at the shelves of baking supplies. "Right. Very important to count the." Evie glanced at the bottle in Piper's hand. "Green sanding sugar. Crucial bakery operation." Piper sighed, setting down the bottle. "Is everyone still talking about it?" "Only slightly less than they're talking to Jack about it." Evie grinned. "He's fielding relentless teasing with his typical stoicism, though his ears turned suspiciously red when Mrs. Foster asked if he'd found your whisk yet." Piper groaned, leaning against the shelves. "It's just a silly tradition." "Maybe," Evie conceded. "But you should have seen his face when he thought no one was watching." "I haven't seen him look that way since." She trailed off, then shook her head. "Never mind. Just know that you've officially been inducted into Winterberry Ridge gossip. Congratulations." As Evie slipped back out, Piper remained in the closet a moment longer. For the first time since arriving, she realized she was genuinely part of the town's fabric, not just an observer but a participant in its traditions and gossip. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. When she finally emerged, Jack was waiting with a look of grim determination. "We need to finish the display window," he said, nodding toward the front of the bakery. "Evie's handling the counter." The display window was a small alcove, visible from both inside and outside the shop. Jack had already arranged part of a winter wonderland scene, with miniature houses and sugar crystal snowdrifts. The space was tight, forcing them to work in close proximity. Every time Jack reached across her for an ornament, Piper felt hyper-aware of the warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of cinnamon and cloves that seemed permanently baked into his skin. Neither mentioned the whisk directly, creating a charged silence punctuated only by innocuous questions. "Does this frosting look stiff enough for the snowbank?" Piper asked, holding up a piping bag. "A bit more powdered sugar," Jack replied, his voice carefully neutral. When he reached past her for the sugar container, his chest brushed against her back, and she felt his breath hitch in time with her own. For a moment, neither moved. "Sorry," he murmured, stepping back quickly. "It's fine," she answered, voice sounding strange to her own ears. They continued working side by side, the air between them growing increasingly tense. Piper found herself stealing glances at his profile, the determined set of his jaw, the way his forehead creased in concentration as he arranged tiny sugar figurines. The breaking point came when they both reached for the same decoration, fingers tangling around a delicate glass snowflake. Jack didn't immediately pull away. Instead, he met her eyes with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "You know they're all watching us, right?" he murmured, nodding toward the not-so-subtle audience pretending to enjoy coffee at nearby tables. Piper followed his gaze, noticing Mrs. Farnsworth and several others casting casual glances their way.
Does that bother you?
The question left her lips before she could think better of it, surprising herself with her directness. The moment stretched between them, electric and uncertain. Jack's eyes searched hers, as if looking for the answer to a question he couldn't bring himself to ask. Finally, he stepped deliberately closer under the pretense of adjusting a decoration above her head. His voice was low enough that only she could hear, lips close to her ear. I found your whisk. Piper's breath caught. You did. It landed, pointing back toward the bakery door. Her heart stuttered as she processed the implication. According to the superstition, the whisk points toward your true love. The bakery door. Where Jack had been standing. Before she could respond, a customer approached with questions about festival pie orders. Jack stepped back, his professional demeanor slipping back into place like a well-worn coat. We'll finish this later, he said, and Piper wasn't sure if he meant the display or their conversation. For the rest of the afternoon, she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his usual guardedness softened by something that looked dangerously like hope. As Piper arranged cookies in the display case, she realized with a start that she'd stopped thinking about roads clearing or returning to her real life, and the thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure.
Chapter 8. Close enough to touch. Jack rapped his knuckles against the wooden counter twice, an old habit from childhood, his grandmother's superstition for perfect crusts. The familiar rhythm grounded him as he moved through Frost and Crumb's darkened kitchen, finding comfort in the shadows and solitude. The only light came from under-cabinet fixtures and the occasional sweep of headlights from passing snowplows, casting long, wavering shadows across the well-worn floorboards. The clock on the wall read 11:37 p.m., 5 hours before his normal start time, but the festival demanded extra preparation. Jack rolled his shoulders, feeling the pleasant ache of a long day's work as he reached for his grandmother's rolling pin. The worn wooden handles fit his palms perfectly, smooth from decades of use and care. Just us tonight, Eleanor, he murmured to the rolling pin, another habit he'd never quite shaken. Jack unfolded his recipe notebook, though he barely needed to glance at it anymore. His fingers traced the edge of a page where his grandmother's handwriting merged with his own, additions and adjustments made over the years, creating something uniquely theirs. As he measured flour into the large stainless steel bowl, his mind drifted to the whisk incident earlier that day. Piper, standing in the snow with that ridiculous look of mock ceremony on her face as she tossed the whisk. The way her cheeks had flushed when she realized he'd seen her. The knowing looks from Mrs. Farnsworth, and the gaggle of town gossips who'd practically vibrated with delight at the possibilities. Jack shook his head, sending a small cloud of flour into the air. He didn't have time for town superstitions, or the strange, unsettling warmth that spread through his chest whenever Piper looked at him with those bright hazel eyes. The familiar creak of the back door pulled him from his thoughts. Jack tensed, then relaxed when Piper appeared in the doorway, bundled in his old flannel shirt. The sleeves were rolled up several times, but still dangled past her fingertips, and the hem hung almost to her knees over her leggings. Something proprietary and alarming stirred in his chest at the sight of her in his clothes. Couldn't sleep, she offered by way of explanation, padding across the kitchen in thick wool socks. 2 steaming mugs were cradled in her hands, and she set one beside him with careful precision. You neither, apparently. The rich scent of hot chocolate wafted up, along with the unmistakable aroma of cinnamon, the way he secretly preferred it, though he couldn't remember ever telling her so. She'd noticed anyway. Festival prep, he said, gesturing vaguely at his notebook. Gets worse every year. Their fingers brushed as he accepted the mug, and Jack found himself not immediately pulling away. In the dim light, Piper looked different, softer, more real than the polished city professional he'd first met. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot rather than her usual sleek ponytail, and without makeup, he could see a light spray of freckles across her nose and cheeks. Need help? She asked, already reaching for an apron hanging on the nearby hook. Jack opened his mouth to refuse. This was his space, his routine, but found himself nodding instead. If you're up anyway. Wordlessly, they established a working pattern. Jack rolled dough with practiced efficiency, while Piper measured fillings into bowls, following his occasionally muttered directions. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the rolling pin and the soft clink of measuring spoons. He stole glances at her concentrated expression, the way she bit her lower lip when focusing on getting a measurement exactly right, how her usually perfect hair had loosened to frame her face. Jack was struck by how naturally she fit into his space now, how her movements had adapted to complement his own. She'd learned to anticipate when he needed the bench scraper, or when to slide a fresh piece of parchment paper his way. "You're better at this than I expected," he admitted, then immediately regretted his tone. Rather than taking offense, Piper shot him a wry smile. "You know, that might be the closest thing to a compliment I've heard from you. I should mark it on my calendar." "Don't let it go to your head," Jack replied, but his voice lacked its usual gruffness. When they moved to assembling the pies, Piper reached for one of the rolled-out crusts, transferring it with surprising confidence to a waiting pie pan. Her filling technique was precise, but when she attempted to crimp the edges with dramatic flair, the result was a lopsided, uneven disaster that looked like it had been mangled by a particularly enthusiastic child. Jack's criticism died on his lips when she looked up with mock outrage. "Don't you dare say a word, Whitmore," she warned, brandishing a spoonful of apple filling like a weapon. "This is artistic expression." "Is that what we're calling it?" For once he didn't maintain his stern facade but instead found himself smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes. "You're hopeless," he said, but his tone carried no bite. "So teach me," she challenged, pushing the pie toward him. "Show me how it's done, Master Baker." Jack hesitated, then set aside his own work. "It's all in the wrists," he said, positioning himself behind her. "Here." Before he could second-guess himself, he was encircling her with his arms, large hands covering her smaller ones. The position mirrored their previous near moments, but this time neither pulled away. Jack was acutely conscious of her warmth, the faint scent of his soap in her hair, how perfectly she seemed to fit against him. "You need to apply even pressure," he demonstrated, guiding her fingers through the motion. "Like this, not so hard, you're mangling it." Her laugh vibrated against his chest. "So bossy." When she turned her head slightly to ask another question, her profile was illuminated by the soft light, and something shifted in Jack's chest, a sensation like stepping onto what you thought was solid ground only to feel it give way beneath you. "Again," he said, his voice rougher than intended. He cleared his throat. "Try again by yourself." Stepping back felt oddly difficult, like pulling away from a fire on a freezing night. As they continued working through the lineup of festival pies, their conversation deepened. Jack found himself sharing stories he rarely told, about his grandmother teaching him to bake during power outages, using flashlights propped up on flour canisters. "She'd say baking in the dark builds character," he recounted, smiling at the memory. "Really, I think she just liked the adventure of it." "Is that why you're here at midnight, instead of waiting until morning?" Piper asked, sliding a completed pie onto the rack. Jack shrugged. "Habit, I guess. I spent most summers as a teenager sleeping in the apartment upstairs. Would come down at all hours to experiment." "Little Jack Whitmore, rebel baker," she teased, bumping her hip against his as she reached for more flour. "More like hiding out," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "My dad, he wanted me in the family construction business. Every time I came down here instead, it was my own small rebellion." Piper's hand stilled. What changed his mind? "Heart attack when I was in culinary school," Jack said, keeping his eyes on the dough. "He was laid up for months. I came back to help, ended up staying. The bakery was struggling by then. Grandma was getting older." He paused, then added quietly, "When he saw how much it meant to me, he gave his blessing. Died the following winter." Piper's hand settled lightly on his forearm. "I'm sorry, Jack." He nodded, uncomfortable with her sympathy but not pulling away. It was a long time ago. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the quiet punctuated by the occasional instruction or question. Jack found himself relaxing into her presence, the warm comfort of having someone else in his typically solitary nighttime ritual. "What about you?" he asked eventually. "Family business waiting somewhere?" Her expression flickered briefly before she smiled. "No, nothing like that. My parents are academics. They expected me to follow suit, but you had other plans," Jack finished. "Something like that," she said, focus suddenly intense on the apples she was slicing. As they moved into the fourth hour of baking, fatigue began to soften the edges of their usual restraint. Jack caught himself watching Piper's hands, nimble fingers stained with berry juice, a smudge of flour on her wrist that he had to stop himself from brushing away. "So what's the deal with this festival anyway?" she asked, arranging strips of dough for a lattice top. "Everyone talks about it like it's the cornerstone of civilization." Jack considered his answer, rolling out another crust with smooth, practiced motions. "For some people, it is. Winterberry Ridge was founded during a particularly harsh winter. The festival celebrates survival, community. Reminds us why we're here." Piper's expression turned thoughtful. "And for you? What does it mean to you personally?" His honest answer surprised even himself. "It's the time when this place feels most like home." He kept his eyes on his work, smoothing the dough with careful attention. "Even the years when nothing else felt right, the festival made me feel part of something larger than myself." Looking up from the dough he'd been unnecessarily reworking, he found Piper watching him with an expression that made his next words catch in his throat. Something soft and searching that made him feel seen in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "That's beautiful," she said simply. Jack cleared his throat, discomfort with his own vulnerability rising. "It's just traditions. Every small town has them." "No," Piper shook her head firmly. "It's more than that. You can feel it in how everyone talks about this place, how they look after each other. It's special." There was a wistfulness in her voice that caught his attention. "You don't have anything like that where you're from?" She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Not exactly. We had neighborhood block parties, but nobody knew each other's names. Just showed up for the free food and left." "Sounds lonely." "It was efficient," she corrected, then sighed. "But yes, lonely is the right word." The quiet admission hung between them as they continued working, the pile of finished pies growing steadily. When they reached the showstopper, his grandmother's award-winning blackberry pie, Jack hesitated, rolling and re-rolling the edge of the dough. "Something wrong?" Piper asked, noticing his distraction. "This one needs to be perfect," he said, frowning at a nearly imperceptible flaw in the crust. "It's for the competition." Jack nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "I thought you weren't entering." Piper leaned against the counter, studying him. "What changed your mind?" He worked in silence for a moment, before responding. "You did." "Me?" Her surprise was evident. "Your ridiculous enthusiasm," he clarified quickly. "And Mrs. Farnsworth's guilt trips." Piper smiled knowingly. "Ah, so it has nothing to do with wanting to defend your family honor." Jack couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. Maybe a little of that, too. As he carefully placed the lattice over the filling, a realization struck him. He was nervous. Not about the competition itself, but about what it represented. "My grandmother won every year she entered," he said quietly. "First with her apple bourbon, then with this blackberry recipe. When she got sick, she made me promise I'd keep entering. I did, for a while. Then I just stopped." "Why?" Piper asked, her voice gentle. Jack's hand stilled on the dough. "Because I was afraid of failing her," he admitted quietly. "She believed in me more than I deserved." Piper stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. She was right to. The directness in her hazel eyes stripped away his usual defenses, leaving him feeling exposed in a way that should be terrifying, but somehow wasn't. No one had looked at him with such unguarded faith in years. Jack cleared his throat, suddenly needing to lighten the moment. "You're just saying that because you want me to feed you pie." "Well, that too," she grinned, reaching to straighten a piece of lattice that had gone astray. Their hands collided, both now covered in flour and bits of dough. Instead of pulling away, Piper deliberately wiped a floury finger across his cheek. "Mature," he deadpanned, though his heart rate had kicked up several notches. Her answering smile was mischievous. "Mrs. Farnsworth says you need to loosen up. Something about being Winterberry Ridge's grumpy bachelor mascot." "Mrs. Farnsworth needs a hobby that isn't my personal life," Jack grumbled, though without heat. Before he could think better of it, he flicked a small amount of flour back at her, catching her by surprise. Her mock gasp of outrage made something warm unfurl in his chest. "Jack Whitmore, did you just—" "You started it," he pointed out, feeling ridiculously young and light. Piper's laugh cut off abruptly as Jack reached to brush flour from her cheek, his motions slowing as his hand made contact. His palm lingered, cupping her face, his thumb almost unconsciously tracing the edge of her lip where a small smile still played. Time suspended as they breathed in the charged silence, the question in his eyes answered by the slight tilt of her head toward his touch. Her pupils dilated, the gold flecks in her hazel eyes catching the dim light. Jack leaned in slowly, so slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Their lips brushed hesitantly, just the lightest contact, testing. When she didn't back away, but instead let out a soft sigh against his mouth, his restraint crumbled. His hands tangled in her hair as he deepened the kiss, tasting cinnamon and warmth. Piper responded with equal intensity, fingers gripping his flour-dusted shirt as if anchoring herself. Every barrier he'd carefully maintained dissolved as he lost himself in the kiss, in the soft sound she made when he pulled her closer, in the perfect rightness of her in his arms. Her body fit against his like she belonged there, warm and solid and real. Jack kissed her like he was trying to memorize her, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other slid to the small of her back, drawing her impossibly closer. When they broke apart for air, Piper's eyes remained closed for a moment, her lips still parted. She looked dazed and impossibly beautiful standing in his kitchen wearing his flannel, covered in the evidence of their night's work together. That image, Piper looking so perfectly at home in his world, was what finally broke through the haze of desire. Reality crashed back with brutal clarity. Jack broke the kiss fully, though he couldn't quite make himself pull away completely. His forehead rested against hers, as his thundering heartbeat slowly steadied. The intensity of what he felt terrified him. He never intended to care this much for someone who was just passing through. He saw Winterberry Ridge suddenly through her eyes, a quaint anecdote for her travel blog, a temporary shelter from whatever she was running from, but not home. Not permanent. As Piper smiled up at him, eyes bright with something that looked dangerously like happiness, panic tightened his chest. Jack's retreat was subtle but unmistakable. He straightened, putting physical distance between them, his hands dropping to his sides as his expression closed off. "I should check the ovens," he muttered, turning away from the confusion blooming on her face. He busied himself with unnecessary tasks, checking the temperature gauge that he knew was perfectly calibrated, rearranging pies that were already in optimal positions, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. Each movement built another brick in the wall between them, a desperate attempt to protect himself from the inevitable. Piper watched him, her confusion gradually shifting to hurt as she realized what was happening. When she tentatively touched his arm, her voice was uncertain. "Jack, we should focus on finishing these pies," he responded with forced casualness, not meeting her eyes. "The festival committee expects them by 7. The hurt that flashed across her face cut him deeply, but he convinced himself it was better this way. Better to pull back now than when she inevitably left, taking a piece of his heart with her. Better not to fool himself into thinking someone like Piper would ever choose someone like him, choose a life in Winterberry Ridge, over whatever exciting existence awaited her back in the real world. "Right," she said after a moment, her voice carefully neutral. "Of course." They returned to work in silence, the space between them filled with unspoken words and the lingering taste of what could have been. Dawn began to lighten the windows, casting long blue shadows across the bakery they'd shared all night, the pale winter light illuminating the distance Jack had put between them, a distance that felt both necessary and unbearable.
Chapter 9. The Shatter. Piper's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the red checkered tablecloth across the display table. The Winter Festival pie competition tent hummed with activity, volunteers stringing twinkling lights overhead, the scent of cinnamon and pine needles hanging in the crisp air. She carefully arranged the hand-lettered signs for Jack's entries: bourbon apple crumble, winter spice medley, and cranberry custard with brown sugar crust. Her fingers lingered over his name, tracing the letters she'd penned herself that morning. Last night's kiss replayed in her mind like a movie scene she couldn't stop watching. The way his calloused hands had cradled her face, how he'd held her like she was something precious and breakable before abruptly pulling away. The memory of flour dusting his hair, and the stunned look in his eyes made her stomach flip. "Is that crooked?" she asked no one in particular, tilting her head at the frost and crumb banner she'd hung. Across the tent, Jack meticulously arranged his pie display, shoulders tense beneath his navy flannel shirt. He hadn't mentioned the kiss at breakfast, had barely spoken 10 words to her, but she'd caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. "Looks perfect to me, dear." Mrs. Farnsworth appeared at her elbow, peering critically at the display. "Though I might shift that cranberry custard forward. It's his secret weapon this year." Piper adjusted the pie, smiling. "How do you know it's his secret weapon?" 30 years of judging this competition. I know Jack Whitmore's strategy like I know my own knitting patterns. He always puts his most confident entry in the back row. "That is exactly the kind of insider information I was hoping to learn," Piper laughed, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in months, maybe years. Mrs. Farnsworth patted her arm. "You're doing a fine job, dear. Who would have thought Jack's stranded visitor would become our festival's saving grace? The signage alone is the best we've had in decades." Pride bloomed in Piper's chest. Her corporate marketing skills had found an unexpected outlet in hand-lettered signs and booth arrangements. For the first time in ages, she felt present rather than calculating her next move, next promotion, next achievement to chase. "Jack's lucky to have found you," Mrs. Farnsworth added with a meaningful arch of her eyebrow before drifting away to inspect another competitor's table. Piper watched Jack's familiar movements, the precise way he aligned each fork, the slight furrow between his eyebrows as he concentrated. She mentally composed notes for her fictional travel blog. In Winterberry Ridge, baking isn't just cooking, it's legacy carried through generations in cast iron pans and recipe cards worn soft at the edges. The words flowed easily, capturing something genuine despite their intended deception. She needed to tell him the truth. After the competition, when the pressure of winning wasn't looming over him, he deserved to know who she really was before what? Before she left? The thought created a hollow ache she wasn't prepared to examine. "Piper. Just the woman I wanted to see." Evie bounced toward her, clipboard clutched to her chest. "Can you help judge the children's snowman contest at 3? Our usual judge has the flu, and you have such a good eye for detail." "Me? But I'm an outsider." Evie snorted. "Please. Half the town thinks you've lived here forever. You organized the volunteer schedule, rescued the Banter situation, and somehow got Old Man Chester to donate his maple syrup for the pancake breakfast. You're practically the unofficial deputy mayor of Winterberry." Warmth spread through Piper as she glanced around. People nodded and waved as they passed, not greeting her as Jack's visitor anymore, but as Piper, with warm smiles and inside jokes. A week ago, she hadn't known these people existed. Now she knew that Ted's daughter was applying to colleges, that Marnie was secretly taking online pottery classes, that the twins who ran the hardware store had an ongoing feud about proper snowblower maintenance. "I'd love to judge the snowmen," she said, surprised to find she meant it. As the morning progressed, Piper moved through the festival with growing confidence, stopping to chat with locals who no longer treated her with curious suspicion. She helped hang lanterns along the pathway, tested the sound system for the carolers, and arranged donation jars for the town's winter coat drive. Occasionally, she'd spot Jack across the busy square, his tall frame easy to track as he carried supplies or checked on his pies. Once their eyes met over the crowd, and instead of looking away, he held her gaze for one heart-stopping moment before a group of children swarmed around him, breaking the connection. "You look like a woman with something on her mind," said a gruff voice behind her. Piper turned to find Mrs. Farnsworth observing her with shrewd eyes. "Just thinking about how different everything feels." Piper gestured around them. "A week ago I was racing between meetings, checking email every 30 seconds, and treating meals like inconvenient interruptions. And now I'm debating the artistic merits of 9-year-old snowmen, and it somehow feels more important." Mrs. Farnsworth smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "That's what Winterberry does. Helps you sort what matters from what doesn't." She patted Piper's arm conspiratorially when Jack wasn't looking. Some people take longer to figure it out than others. The insinuation was clear. Warmth crept up Piper's cheeks. I'm not sure Jack sees it that way, she said quietly. That boy wouldn't recognize a good thing if it whacked him with a rolling pin. Mrs. Farnsworth shook her head. But he's coming around. I've known him since he was knee-high to a snowplow. The judges began gathering near the pie tent, checking clipboards and adjusting their ceremonial red scarves. Jack moved toward his display, shoulders squared like a soldier heading into battle. He's nervous, Piper realized aloud. Pretends he doesn't care, but that blue ribbon means the world to him. His father won it 15 years straight. Piper watched him adjust and readjust a fork, wiping invisible dust from the tablecloth. Without thinking, she crossed the tent and approached him. Hey, she said. Jack looked up, his expression guarded yet somehow softer at the edges. Hey. The awkwardness of the morning hung between them, neither mentioning the kiss nor its abrupt ending. Your display looks amazing, she offered.
You did most of it.
I just arranged what was already there. He cleared his throat, looking past her shoulder. I should check the oven temperature one more time. They're using electric warmers. Right. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I knew that. This strange, tentative version of Jack, so different from the grumpy baker who'd reluctantly let her in from the snow, made her heart twist. Before she could say anything else, he reached into his pocket. Here, he said, holding out a worn wooden spoon. Its handle was smooth from years of use, a small crack running along one edge that had been carefully sealed. What's this for? My grandmother's lucky spoon. She never lost a competition with it nearby. He swallowed, eyes meeting hers briefly. Thought it might help. Piper took the spoon, their fingers brushing. Despite his emotional withdrawal after their kiss, his eyes softened momentarily. The small gesture, entrusting something of his family's history to her, spoke volumes. I'll guard it with my life, she promised, only half joking. From across the tent, Evie caught her eye and gave an encouraging thumbs up. Piper clutched the spoon tighter, a realization hitting her with sudden, terrifying clarity. She didn't want to leave Winterberry Ridge when the roads cleared. The admission, even to herself, sent a wave of panic through her chest. Before she could process this new understanding, a booming voice cut through the tent's cheerful murmur. Piper Hart? Is that you? Piper froze, her blood turning to ice as she recognized the voice. Slowly, she turned to see Bradley Weber, client of Apex Solutions and owner of a chain of upscale fitness centers, striding toward her with a broad smile. His designer coat and polished demeanor stood out among the festive plaid and practical winter wear of the locals. I can't believe it. Bradley continued, oblivious to her stricken expression. The marketing wizard from Apex Solutions, right here in this tiny town. Heads turned throughout the tent. Piper felt Jack stiffen beside her. Bradley, she managed through numb lips. What are you doing here? Family weekend getaway. Wife's idea, quaint small-town Christmas and all that. He gestured vaguely at a woman examining hand-knit scarves several booths away. But what are you doing playing small-town baker? When your office said you were taking emergency leave, we assumed health issues, not whatever this is. Each word hammered another nail into the coffin of her deception. From the corner of her eye, she saw confusion cross Jack's face, then disbelief, followed by a slow hardening of his features. It's not, I'm just helping out, she stammered. You must be gathering amazing material, Bradley continued, mercifully lowering his voice but still entirely too loud. Our team was just saying how we want more authentic, community-focused marketing for the new locations. You're always 3 steps ahead. No, I'm not working, Hart did our rebrand last quarter, Bradley explained to a nearby elderly couple who weren't remotely interested. Increased our membership conversions by 32%. Absolute genius with demographics and targeted messaging. Bradley, please. So is this some kind of undercover market research? He asked, looking around curiously at the pie displays. The tent fell silent. Piper could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She turned to Jack, words already forming on her lips, but the look on his face stopped her cold. "So you're not a travel blogger?" His voice was controlled but ice-cold. Not a question, but an indictment. The betrayal in his eyes made her physically flinch. She reached for his arm. "Jack, I can explain. I was going to tell you." "When?" He stepped backward, out of her reach. "After you got enough quirky small-town anecdotes for whatever campaign you're working on?" "No. It's not like that at all." She could see the walls rebuilding, thicker, higher than before, as his expression shuddered. "I had a panic attack," she said quickly. "At work. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I just got in my car and drove, no plan, no destination. Then the accident happened, and you took me in, and it felt like I could breathe again." Jack's jaw tightened. "And the travel blog?" "A lie. I'm sorry. I panicked, and it just came out." Bradley, finally sensing the tension, took a small step back. "I should find Jessica." "Great seeing you, Piper. Call me about that campaign idea." He retreated, but the damage was done. Around them, festival goers pretended not to listen while straining to catch every word. "Jack," she tried again, "none of what happened between us was fabricated. Not my feelings, not... Was anything you told me true?" His voice grew more cutting. "Or was Winterberry Ridge just a quaint little experiment? See how the small-town baker lives?" Each word landed like a physical blow. Piper saw the weight of previous betrayals behind his anger, the confirmation of expectations he'd held since she arrived. In his eyes, she had become proof that everyone from the real world saw his home as nothing but a charming pit stop. "That's not fair," she whispered. "You're not listening." "Save it for your marketing report," he interrupted. "I'm sure grumpy local baker will make a colorful character study." The cruelty was so unlike him, and yet completely in character for the defensive man she'd first met. He'd warned her from the beginning, he didn't trust easily, especially not outsiders who saw Winterberry Ridge as quaint rather than home. "Judging begins in 5 minutes," announced one of the red-scarved officials, voice unnaturally bright in the tense atmosphere. Jack turned away. "I need to check my entries." "Jack, please." But he was already walking away, shoulders rigid, leaving Piper standing amid curious onlookers and hushed whispers. The festival continued around her, colorful and cheerful, in cruel contrast to the collapse of everything she didn't know she wanted until this moment. Fighting tears, she pushed through the crowd and out of the tent, gulping cold air that did nothing to ease the tightness in her chest. She wandered blindly until she found an empty bench away from the festival's main pathways, collapsing onto it as snowflakes began to fall. She sat there as minutes stretched into an hour, snow collecting on her uncovered head, her thoughts circling like birds with nowhere to land. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably Bradley, following up on his campaign idea. She ignored it. "Found you." Piper looked up to see Evie standing before her, cheeks pink from the cold, expression uncharacteristically serious. "Come to yell at me too?" Instead of answering, Evie brushed snow from the bench and sat beside her. "So not a travel blogger?" A humorless laugh escaped Piper's throat. "Not even close." "I figured. You take too many notes on napkins to be a real writer." Despite everything, Piper felt her lips twitch. "Is Jack okay?" "He's Jack. He'll survive." Evie paused. "Want to tell me the real story?" The explanation tumbled out. The pressure cooker job where 80-hour weeks were the minimum expectation. The panic attacks that had started small and grown until one day she couldn't remember how to breathe. The impromptu drive with no destination, just a desperate need to escape. How the accident forced her to stop running. "I was going to tell him," she finished lamely, "after the competition. When he wasn't stressed about winning." Evie's expression softened. "For what it's worth, I believe you."
He doesn't.
Jack has history with people who see Winterberry Ridge as charming but ultimately provincial. His ex? Evie nodded. Cassandra. big city architect who thought Jack's dedication to the bakery was adorably rustic, until she realized he actually intended to stay here forever. She sighed. When she left, she told him his ambitions were as small as the town. That's awful. You became his worst fear confirmed, Evie explained not unkindly. The outsider who finds us quaint but temporary. Piper thought about the wooden spoon, now heavy in her pocket. It's not temporary. At least, I don't want it to be. Have you told him that? I tried. He wouldn't listen. Jack doesn't trust easily, and he trusts twice even less. Evie brushed snow from her knitted hat. What will you do now? The question hung between them as cheers erupted from the festival grounds. The announcement of winners had begun. I should go back to the city, Piper said hollowly. My emergency leave ends in 2 days anyway. Is that what you want? Before she could answer, they heard the echo of the announcer's voice. And this year's blue ribbon for Best Traditional Pie goes to Jack Whitmore of Frost and Crumb Bakery. More cheers, then a confused murmur when no one came forward to accept the prize. He's not there, Piper realized. He worked so hard and he's missing his moment. Something shifted in her chest, determination replacing despair. She stood abruptly, brushing snow from her coat. Do you need a ride back to Jack's to pack your things? Evie asked. Piper shook her head. No. A plan was already forming. Does the bakery still have that old banner-making kit from the summer fair? The one with the fabric paints? I think so. Why? I need your help. And probably Mrs. Farnsworth's too. For what? Piper smiled, the first genuine one since Bradley's arrival. To show Jack what I couldn't tell him. An hour later, Piper was elbow-deep in fabric paint in Frost and Crumb's back room, her marketing skills finally serving a purpose that mattered as she sketched designs on butcher paper. You want to hang them where? Mrs. Farnsworth asked, peering at Piper's outline. From the clock tower down Main Street and ending at Frost and Crumb. Piper checked measurements on her diagram. We'll need Ted's ladder truck for the high spots. In this snow? Evie looked skeptical but impressed. That's either the most romantic gesture I've ever heard or complete insanity. Maybe both, Piper admitted. He won't listen to me now, so I'll have to show him instead. Her phone buzzed again. This time she glanced at the screen to see her boss's name. Urgent, return to office required. She silenced it without a second thought. The roads are finally clearing, Mrs. Farnsworth pointed out. You could just leave. Start fresh somewhere. Why go to all this trouble for a man who wouldn't hear you out? Piper looked up from her sketches, certainty settling over her like a warm blanket. Because for the first time in my life, I found somewhere that feels like I'm not just passing through. Evie and Mrs. Farnsworth exchanged glances. Well then, Mrs. Farnsworth said with a decisive nod, I'll call the quilting circle. We'll need all hands on deck if we're going to pull this off by morning. As the night deepened, Piper worked steadily, her phone buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from her boss demanding her return. Outside, the snow stopped falling, and road crews began clearing the main highway. But Piper barely noticed, focused entirely on proving to Jack that some things, even things that begin with lies, can end with truth.
Chapter 10. Proof in the Pudding. Jack slammed another ball of dough onto the floured surface, channeling every ounce of frustration into the rhythmic kneading. The familiar motion should have been comforting, it always had been before, but tonight his grandmother's old workshop behind Frost and Crumb felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through frosted windows, and the wooden beams above creaked with the memory of decades of Whitmore stubbornness. He'd been hiding here for hours, working dough that would never become pie. The blue ribbon from the Winterberry Ridge Winter Festival lay discarded on the workbench, the gold lettering catching the light mockingly. First place. What a joke. The victory felt as hollow as the wooden rolling pins hanging on the wall. Jack pressed his knuckles into the dough harder than necessary, replaying the festival scene for the 100th time. The stranger's booming voice cutting through the cheerful crowd noise. Piper Hart. From Accelerate Marketing? The immediate hush falling over the nearby booths. Piper's stricken face, her eyes darting to his, mouth opening to explain. The confirmation of what he'd suspected from the beginning. She was just passing through, collecting quaint stories of small-town life like souvenirs. Travel blogger. What a convenient lie. He slammed the dough down again, flour clouding the air around him. The worst part wasn't even the lie itself. It was how easily he'd started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd seen something worth staying for. The workshop door banged open, sending in a blast of cold air that scattered his bitter thoughts. Cal stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his expression uncharacteristically serious. Without a word, he tossed a folded newspaper onto the bench beside Jack's abandoned ribbon. "Nice to see you too," Jack muttered, not pausing his assault on the innocent doe. Cal stomped his boots on the threshold, knocking snow onto the worn wooden planks. "Heard you made quite the scene at the festival." Jack's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before resuming their work. "That what people are saying?" "That's what happened." Cal's voice held none of its usual teasing warmth. He gestured to the newspaper he'd thrown down, the Winterberry Ridge Weekly, open to the festival coverage. Despite himself, Jack's eyes flicked to the page. There they were, in black and white, him and Piper setting up their booth before everything fell apart. Piper was looking up at him with an expression so soft it made his chest ache. Even in the grainy newsprint, he couldn't dismiss it as fake. "I don't need a recap," Jack said, turning back to his dough. "I was there." Cal shrugged out of his jacket and hung it on the peg by the door, a familiar motion from decades of friendship. "Yeah, you were physically present. Not sure your brain was, though." Jack's jaw tightened. "If you came here to..." "Shut up and listen for once." Cal leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "Your version of events got some major details wrong." A flare of defensive anger surged through Jack's chest. "She lied to me from the moment she walked in. What am I missing? Context. Nuance. Reality." Cal picked up a battered cookie cutter and turned it over in his hands. "Do you even know what she's been doing here while you've been busy scowling at her? Writing her blog posts about the charmingly backwards locals?" Jack's voice dripped with sarcasm. Cal's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Farnsworth's booking system at the inn has been analog since the dawn of time. Piper spent 3 evenings setting up a digital system that doubled their efficiency. Did it on her own time, refused payment." Jack rolled his eyes, though something uncomfortable stirred in his gut. One good deed doesn't. Evie's nephew has that learning disability, the one that makes reading hard. Cal continued as if Jack hadn't spoken. Piper taught him how to use design software so he could turn his assignments into visual presentations. Kids' grades went up 2 letters in a week. Jack stared down at the dough, suddenly aware of how violently he was treating it. He eased back slightly. "And that ancient cash register you've been ignoring for months? The one that kept eating 20s? Fixed. By Piper. While you were asleep." Each example landed like a physical blow, chipping away at Jack's certainty. Memories surfaced of his own. Piper's meticulous attention to the handwritten notes in his recipe cards, her careful handling of his grandmother's measuring cups, the way she'd looked at the bakery, not with condescension but with something closer to longing. "She still lied," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "And you've never hidden behind half-truths because you were scared?" Cal's question was quiet, but landed with precision. Jack's hand stilled in the dough. Images flickered through his mind, himself downplaying culinary school to his father, just taking some classes, nothing serious, brushing off questions about what really happened with his ex. It didn't work out, concealing his own fears behind practical concerns. "The bakery needs me." Cal pressed his advantage. "Did you know she defended Winterberry Ridge to some tourists at the gas station? They were making jokes about it being podunk, and she shut them down so hard, Hank says they practically ran back to their rental car." Jack frowned, trying to hold on to his anger as it slipped through his fingers. "That doesn't mean..." "She stayed up all night helping Evie's grandmother remake quilts after that basement flood. The woman has arthritis so bad she can barely thread a needle, but she was determined those quilts would be ready for the festival display. Piper never mentioned it to anyone. I only know because I drove by at 3 a.m. and saw the lights on. Jack set the dough aside, suddenly too exhausted to keep punishing it. Why are you telling me this? Because you're so busy being right that you're missing what's actually true. Cal's usually joking demeanor had completely vanished. This was Cal at his most real, the friend who'd helped Jack rebuild the bakery roof after the storm of 18, who'd sat silently beside him at his grandmother's funeral when words would have been too much. Jack's chest felt tight. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Cal said carefully, that I overheard something the day before the festival. Piper was on the phone outside my garage. Didn't see me working under the hunter's truck. Jack looked up, something in Cal's tone catching his attention. Her boss was demanding she come back for some emergency meeting. Said her position would be re-evaluated if she didn't. Cal's eyes held Jack steadily. She told them she had more important commitments in Winterberry Ridge. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. When was this? The day before everything blew up. Cal paused. The day after you kissed her, and then pretended it didn't happen. Jack flinched. He hadn't realized anyone knew about that night, the way the pie dough had felt under their hands, how her laughter had turned to something quieter, the way time had seemed to stop when he'd finally given in and kissed her. Or how he'd pulled away afterward, terrified by the depth of what he was feeling, making some excuse about the late hour and early morning. She probably just meant the festival, he said weakly. Cal snorted. Right. Because corporate marketing executives regularly risk their jobs for small-town pie contests. Jack turned away, unable to hold Cal's gaze. The tight ball of anger he'd been nursing since the festival was unraveling, revealing something far more painful underneath: fear. She didn't tell me. His voice came out rougher than intended. About any of it. The job, the reality of who she is. And did you ask? Or were you too busy waiting for her to confirm your worst fears? Jack pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The truth of Cal's words stung. He'd been looking for proof that Piper would leave from the moment she arrived, cataloging each mention of the city, each expression of surprise at small-town ways, filing them away as evidence for when the inevitable goodbye came. What if I let her in and she still leaves? The raw vulnerability in his own question surprised him. It hung in the workshop's dusty air, the real fear finally exposed. Cal's expression softened slightly. What if you don't let her in and regret it forever? Jack's gaze drifted to the shelves where his grandmother's old projects still sat, half-whittled spoons, recipe cards in various stages of completion, the carved wooden sign for Frost and Crumb she'd been redesigning before she got sick. You're turning into your dad, Cal said quietly. And not the good parts. The observation hit hard. Jack's father had nearly lost his mother during their early courtship, too proud to admit he was wrong about some long-forgotten disagreement, almost letting her go back to her hometown rather than apologize. It had become a family legend, how close the entire Whitmore line had come to never existing. A parallel Jack had never wanted to contemplate. Your grandmother always said a Whitmore man would rather be right than happy, Cal added, twisting the knife. Jack's eyes fell on his grandmother's old wooden spoon hanging on the wall, the one he'd entrusted to Piper before the competition. He remembered her words about baking, repeated so often they were carved into his memory. You can follow every rule and still fail if you're afraid to adjust when things don't go as planned. The metaphor struck him with sudden clarity. He'd been following his own rigid rules: outsiders always leave, vulnerability leads to pain, control keeps you safe, refusing to adjust even when something unexpected and wonderful had blown into his life. I really messed up, didn't I? The admission felt like setting down a heavy weight he'd been carrying too long. Cal's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Epically. Jack ran flour-covered fingers through his hair, probably leaving white streaks but beyond caring. She's probably halfway back to the city by now. Actually, Cal said, she's been at Frost and Crumb all night. Jack's head snapped up. What? Cal nodded. Evie called me. Said Piper came back after the festival and hasn't left since. She's working on something and won't let anyone see what it is. This information hit Jack like a physical jolt. He'd assumed she'd be gone by morning, back to her real life, his worst fears about temporary connections confirmed. The realization that she was fighting to stay, even after his public rejection, shook his certainty to its core. That doesn't make sense, he muttered more to himself than to Cal. Why would she stay? Oh, I don't know, Cal deadpanned. Maybe because some stubborn baker made her fall for this place. Or for him. Or both. Jack began pacing the small workshop, his mental barriers crumbling with each step. She's probably just finishing her blog post about quaint, angry locals, he said, but there was no conviction in it. Cal watched him with knowing eyes. Sure. That's definitely it. Even if she meant it now, eventually she'd miss her real life. Jack's pace quickened, his hands flexing at his sides. The city, her career, everything she built there. Maybe. Cal shrugged. Or maybe you don't get to decide what her real life is. Jack stopped pacing suddenly. What if I'm the one who pushed her away, not the other way around? The question hung in the air between them. Cal didn't answer, didn't need to. The truth was written all over Jack's face as realization dawned, how his defensiveness had masked his fear, how he'd been so focused on protecting himself that he'd hurt them both. He thought of Piper's face that first morning in the bakery, challenging him about his display case. Her voice the night they'd nearly frozen, telling stories by the fire. The way her eyes had lit up when she'd mastered his grandmother's crust technique. The softness in her expression just before he'd kissed her, and the hurt confusion after he'd pulled away. What had she been trying to tell him all along that he'd been too scared to hear? Jack moved with sudden purpose to the wall where his grandmother's worn tools hung, taking down her favorite pie spoon. He rubbed his thumb over the worn wood, feeling the decades of use in its smooth handle. Then he walked to the workbench and picked up the discarded blue ribbon, tucking both items carefully into his pocket. I need to talk to her, he said, voice steady with newfound resolve. Cal's expression held both relief and challenge. Talk, yes. But more importantly, you need to listen. Jack nodded once, sharply, and headed for the door. The familiar weight of pride and fear tried to hold him back, but for once he pushed through it. As he stepped out into the cold evening air, Cal called after him. And for what it's worth, the Jack Whitmore I know doesn't quit on something that matters because it got hard. The words followed Jack as he strode through the snow toward Frost and Crumb, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He was terrified, of rejection, of vulnerability, of the possibility that it still might not work out even if he laid his heart bare. But for the first time in years, the fear of missing something real outweighed the fear of getting hurt. Some risks, he was finally understanding, were worth taking, even if they hurt, even if they might end, even if they required him to be vulnerable in ways he'd spent years avoiding. The lights of Frost and Crumb glowed warmly in the distance, guiding him home.
Chapter 11. Saving Frost and Crumb. Piper slipped through the back door of Frost and Crumb at 4:30 a.m., careful not to make a sound. The familiar scent of butter and vanilla wrapped around her like an embrace, somehow both comforting and painful now. Jack's kitchen gleamed in the pre-dawn darkness, immaculate as always. She hesitated only a moment, before flicking on the lights and getting to work. Hours later, she stood surrounded by evidence of her all-night efforts. Dozens of pies cooling on every available surface, handwritten cards describing each flavor in her neat penmanship, and a large banner she'd carefully painted, Winterberry Rebuild Pie Auction. The corporate efficiency she'd spent years honing had poured into this last-ditch effort. Spreadsheets of ingredients, cost projections, and a meticulous timeline taped to the wall beside Jack's faded recipe cards. Her fingers traced his handwriting, the slanted capital letters, the way he crossed his T's with decisive strokes. She remembered how those hands had guided hers, teaching her the perfect pressure for crimping dough. Though exhaustion dragged at her limbs, her resolve hadn't wavered. Before leaving Winterberry Ridge, she'd show Jack who she really was, not who he feared she might be. She checked her watch. 2 hours until the auction was scheduled to begin. Enough time to deliver everything to the town square, and set up the display she'd sketched out on 3 separate napkins. The kitchen door swung open, and she startled, nearly dropping the apple crumb pie she'd been boxing. Holy snowballs! Evie stood in the doorway, flour-dusted apron already tied around her waist. Her eyes widened as she took in the transformed kitchen. Did you sleep at all? Sleep is overrated. Piper attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I've pulled plenty of all-nighters for campaigns that mattered less than this. Evie circled the kitchen, eyebrows rising as she inspected the pies. Her skepticism slowly shifted to reluctant admiration. These actually look decent. I followed Jack's recipes exactly, Piper said, continuing to pack pies into the boxes she'd scrounged from storage. Down to the teaspoon. And all this is for? Evie gestured at the banner. An auction to raise funds for storm-damaged businesses, Piper explained, tapping the spreadsheet. Frost and Crumb's sign, the hardware store's awning, those vintage lampposts on Oak Street that got knocked down. I made priority tiers based on historical significance and repair urgency. Of course you did. Evie's lips twitched. Why don't you just write a check? Aren't corporate marketing people loaded? Piper paused, a carefully wrapped blackberry lattice pie halfway into its box. Money's easy. This isn't about money. She met Evie's eyes directly. It's about showing I understand what matters here. The simple honesty hung in the air between them. Evie studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, before nodding slowly and reaching for an apron hanging by the door. Tell me what you need me to do. 2 hours later, anxiety tightened Piper's chest as she adjusted the final display in the town square. Despite Evie's help, she felt painfully conspicuous under the curious, sometimes hostile gazes of townspeople who had heard about her deception. The whispers followed her like a shadow. That's the fake blogger. Lied to everyone, especially Jack. City people always think they can. She straightened a small mountain of pie boxes, pretending not to notice when conversation died as she passed. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow, almost painfully bright. Perfect weather for the auction. At least something was going right. You've arranged them by flavor rather than size, Mrs. Farnsworth's crisp voice came from behind her. Interesting choice. Piper turned to find the older woman inspecting the pie display with critical eyes, her silver hair gleaming in the winter light. I grouped fruit pies, custard pies, and specialty flavors, Piper explained. I thought it would make bidding more organized. Mrs. Farnsworth hummed noncommittally, running a gloved finger along the edge of the display table. Your sign is crooked. Piper immediately moved to adjust it, but Mrs. Farnsworth's hand on her arm stopped her. I'll handle the auction, she announced. You look like you haven't slept in days. The unexpected support brought Piper perilously close to tears, but she swallowed hard. I can manage. I've run bigger events than. This isn't a corporate presentation, young lady. Mrs. Farnsworth's voice softened a fraction. This is Winterberry making up its mind about you. Best let someone who's lived here 73 years do some of the talking. Piper blinked rapidly, maintaining her composure as she arranged cups of Jack's grandmother's punch recipe in vintage glasses she'd found stored in the bakery basement. Thank you, she managed, voice barely steady. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Farnsworth warned. I'm still deciding what I think of all this myself. As the appointed hour approached, the crowd grew larger than Piper had dared hope. Familiar faces from her weeks in Winterberry Ridge gathered around the display, examining the pies with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. She spotted Bradley Weber, the client who'd exposed her identity, standing near the back with his family. The sight of him sent a cold spike through her chest. Her corporate phone buzzed in her pocket with what was certainly another message from her boss. She'd been ignoring them for days now, each one more urgent than the last. The choice loomed before her. She couldn't keep stretching this limbo forever. Ready. Mrs. Farnsworth appeared at her elbow, auction list in hand. Piper nodded, throat suddenly dry. She stepped up to the makeshift podium, conscious of Evie's encouraging thumbs up from beside the pie display. The crowd's chatter died down as she adjusted the microphone. Her corporate presentation skills served her now as she forced herself to stand tall, chin up, shoulders back. "Good morning," she began, her voice clearer than she felt inside. "Thank you all for coming today." The crowd stared back, expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. She fought the urge to fidget with her notes. "Most of you know by now that I'm not a travel blogger." The admission sent ripples through the crowd. Unlike her polished work presentations where she'd mastered the art of cool confidence, Piper's hands trembled visibly on the podium. "I'm a marketing executive who was running away from burnout when my car crashed." A murmur went through the gathering. Someone near the back muttered something that sounded suspiciously like city folk. "I wasn't honest about why I was here," she continued, "and I'm sorry for that. But I'd like to explain if you'll give me a chance." She paused, scanning the crowd nervously. Then her heart stuttered. Jack stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She hadn't seen him since their confrontation at the festival. The sight of him made her words catch momentarily before she forced herself to continue. "Winterberry Ridge wasn't supposed to be anything but a footnote in my journal, somewhere I passed through on my way back to real life." Her voice caught as she added, "I never expected it to show me what real life could actually be." She described the specific moments that had changed her, helping Mrs. Farnsworth reorganize the inn's ancient filing system into something approaching the 21st century, showing Evie's nephew how to use design software for his school project, the town's immediate acceptance of a stranger despite her awkward city ways. "When I saw the storm damage to the buildings on Main Street, I realized these aren't just structures, they're your history, your legacy." She pulled out her portfolio, flipping it open to show the detailed sketches she'd made. "I understand that now." She held up renderings of restored storefronts, including detailed plans for Frost and Crumb's sign that honored its original design while strengthening its structure against future storms. "That's why today's auction isn't just about raising money, though we definitely need that too." A hesitant chuckle rippled through the crowd. "It's about preserving what makes Winterberry Ridge special." She paused, gathering courage before adding quietly, "Some people think I was just collecting quaint stories about small-town life. The truth is, Winterberry Ridge was collecting pieces of me that I didn't know were missing." Her eyes found Jack again, unable to look away as the distance between them seemed to both expand and contract. His expression had shifted, still guarded, but with something else she couldn't quite read. Without looking away from him, she addressed the hidden heart of her confession. "I lied about being a travel blogger. I lied about why I was here. But I never lied about who I became while I was here, or how I felt about," she swallowed hard, "about the people who made me feel at home for the first time in my life." The silence that followed felt endless, a chasm she wasn't sure how to cross. Then Mrs. Farnsworth stepped forward, her authoritative voice cutting through the tension. "Well, that's quite enough emotion before lunch," she declared, taking command of the microphone. "Now, who'll start the bidding on this lovely blueberry crumble?" Initial bidding was hesitant. Piper held her breath as Mrs. Farnsworth's first call went unanswered. Then Cal's voice rang out from the back. $50 for that blueberry one." Piper's head snapped up in surprise. The pie was lovely, but certainly not worth $50. Cal caught her eye and winked. $50 going once. Mrs. Farnsworth called. 55. Someone else called, and suddenly the ice was broken. The auction picked up momentum as townspeople stepped forward, some still eyeing Piper warily, others offering encouraging smiles. She worked alongside Evie, wrapping purchases and thanking bidders, hyper-aware of Jack's presence though he remained at a distance, watching but not approaching. "Excellent choice," she said as she handed Mrs. Diaz from the hardware store a carefully boxed cherry pie. "The lattice took me 3 tries." "You made all these yourself?" Mrs. Diaz asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Every one," Piper confirmed. "Though I used Jack's recipes. I wouldn't dare mess with perfection." Mrs. Diaz's expression softened slightly. "Well, it's for a good cause." To Piper's surprise, Bradley Weber approached the table with his family in tow. Her stomach clenched at the sight of the man who had unwittingly exposed her. "Miss Hart, Brilliant event. He boomed, slapping down cash for 2 pies. Using authentic local traditions to revitalize community engagement? This is why Apex pays her the big bucks. Though he completely misunderstood her intentions, his corporate endorsement somehow legitimized her in the eyes of wavering townspeople. Several who had been holding back stepped forward to bid. Piper caught Mrs. Farnsworth's amused glance and managed a genuine laugh for the first time in days. "He thinks this is a marketing stunt, doesn't he?" Evie whispered. "Let him," Piper whispered back. He just bid $80 on a pecan pie. The auction continued successfully until only 1 pie remained, Jack's award-winning bourbon apple, which she'd saved for last. Mrs. Farnsworth was building up quite the dramatic pitch when disaster struck. Piper reached for the pie to display it to the eager crowd, but exhaustion had made her clumsy. The pie slipped from her grasp, landing with a sickening splat on the snow-covered ground. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Piper froze, her tired brain struggling to process what had happened. Then she dropped to her knees, frantically trying to salvage the ruined dessert, feeling it symbolize everything falling apart. "I'm so sorry," she babbled, scooping up chunks of pastry and filling. "I can fix this, I can?" To her surprise, townspeople gathered around, offering napkins and sympathy rather than judgment. Mrs. Diaz squeezed her shoulder. "Honey, we've all dropped pies before. Jack included." The woman's eyes twinkled. "That boy once launched a whole cherry pie across this square trying to avoid his grandmother's matchmaking." Piper looked up, finding unexpected warmth in faces that had been cold just hours before. "Did he really?" "Hit old Mayor Whitfield right in his Sunday best," someone else added, triggering laughter. As they helped clean up the mess, a small voice piped up from the crowd. "Excuse me, please." The circle parted to reveal 6-year-old Emma, daughter of the town librarian, clutching a pink plastic piggy bank shaped like a unicorn. "This is for Mr. Jack's sign," she said solemnly, holding it out to Piper. "Because he gives me free cookies when Mom's not looking." Piper stared at the little girl, something breaking open inside her chest. All the emotions she'd been holding back, fear, hope, exhaustion, longing, spilled over at once. Tears streamed freely down her face as she knelt to accept the piggy bank. "Thank you," she whispered, hugging Emma tightly. "Thank you so much." Looking up through blurred vision, she found Jack had moved closer, no longer at the crowd's edge but standing just a few feet away. His expression wasn't guarded anymore but searching, witnessing her unfiltered emotion. As the crowd dispersed, Piper stood alone at the table, tallying the impressive proceeds. The event had raised over $2,000, more than enough to fix the storm damage and have a little left over for the spring planting fund. Her corporate phone buzzed again. She pulled it out, reading her boss's final warning: "Return to work Monday or don't return at all." With a deep breath, she typed her response: "I resign. Thank you for everything." She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. A bridge burned with no guarantee of what came next. The decision should have terrified her. Piper Hart without a 5-year plan, without a corporate safety net, without the identity she'd spent years building. Instead, it brought unexpected peace. She was so absorbed in this strange new feeling that she didn't notice Jack's approach until his shadow fell across the table. Looking up, she found him standing before her, holding the blue ribbon from the pie contest and something else, the whisk she'd tossed into the snow days earlier. "You dropped this," he said quietly, holding both out to her. "Twice now." The festival lights strung around the square illuminated his face, uncertain, hopeful, and finally unmistakably open. His eyes held that softness she'd glimpsed in rare moments when his guard was down. "Jack, she started, then stopped. For once, words failed the woman who made her living with them. He didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, he waited, patient as dough rising, steady as the mountains surrounding Winterberry Ridge. Piper reached for the offerings with trembling fingers. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, clutching the ribbon and whisk. "I just quit my job. I have no plan. Me without a plan." She laughed shakily. "That's new." "New can be good," Jack said, his voice low and warm. "Even for a man who uses his great-grandmother's rolling pin?" A smile tugged at his lips. Maybe especially for him. Piper looked around at the town square, at the faces that had become familiar, at the snow-covered peaks beyond. For the first time in her life, she wasn't itching to be somewhere else, planning the next step, the next move, the next achievement. "I'd like to stay," she said softly. "If that's okay." Jack's hand reached for hers, calloused fingers brushing her skin with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I'd like that too," he said. His touch anchored her, not holding her down but holding her steady. Like the foundations of Winterberry Ridge itself, built to weather any storm. Piper's heart beat a new rhythm, not the frantic pace of deadlines and expectations, but something deeper, something lasting. For the first time in her life, Piper's heart was ready to stay still long enough to find out what came next.
Chapter 12. Love in the Flakes. Jack stood in the silent bakery, dawn's pale light seeping through frosted windows. Frost and Crumb felt different this morning, quieter somehow, yet filled with echoes of Piper's presence. The evidence of her night-long efforts surrounded him. Flour-dusted counters, neatly labeled recipe cards stacked in perfect piles, and a detailed spreadsheet tracking auction proceeds taped to the register. She'd even calculated how much each storefront would need for repairs, with Frost and Crumb's sign repair circled twice. His fingers brushed over her handwriting, on his grandmother's recipe cards. Tiny, considerate notes marked each one. "Don't overwork dough and extra cinnamon, and Jack likes these spicier." The care in those details struck him harder than any grand gesture could have. She hadn't just used these recipes, she'd tried to understand them, understand him. Through the windows he watched townsfolk dispersing from the town square, many carrying pie boxes tied with bright ribbons. Mrs. Diaz cradled her purchase like a newborn, and even gruff old Ted Blake had 2 boxes balanced in his weathered hands. They'd forgiven her instantly, these people who held grudges about parking spaces for decades. While he, the man she'd baked for, argued with, and kissed like her life depended on it, had offered nothing but cold rejection. Cal's words from yesterday echoed in his head. "You're not protecting yourself from getting hurt, Jack. You're ensuring it." Jack moved through the space slowly, seeing it through new eyes. Every corner held traces of Piper now. The mismatched mugs she'd reorganized by color. "It's more visually appealing, Jack. Customers eat with their eyes first." The ancient chalkboard menu where her neat handwriting had replaced his chicken scratch. Even the prehistoric radio that had squawked static for years now played soft music, fixed by Piper when he insisted it was beyond repair. Her presence had seeped into Frost and Crumb just as it had into his life, never dominating or changing its essence, but enhancing what was already there, making everything better. "Damn it," he muttered, bracing his hands on the counter. A notebook lay abandoned beside the register, open to a page filled with Piper's handwriting. Unlike her auction spreadsheet, these pages were messy and emotional, words crossed out and rewritten, coffee stains marking the corners. Drafts of her speech. He shouldn't read it. He should close it, and? His eyes caught on a line halfway down. "Winterberry Ridge showed me the difference between success and happiness, and how rarely I'd chosen the latter." Below it, scratched out but still legible, "Jack taught me that genuine connection is worth more than any career milestone. I've succeeded at everything except what matters." The raw honesty in these private thoughts contrasted sharply with his accusation that everything about her was calculated. These weren't the words of someone spinning a story. These were the rawest parts of herself, never meant for public consumption. A memory surfaced, Piper's face when he'd accused her of using the town, using him, for her marketing schemes. The hurt in her eyes hadn't been wounded pride. It had been the devastation of someone whose intentions had been completely misunderstood. Jack moved toward the refrigerator to grab milk for coffee, wrestling with the uncomfortable knowledge that he'd been spectacularly wrong. When he pulled open the door, something caught his eye on the bottom shelf, partially hidden behind containers of cream. A small, imperfect pie sat on a plain white plate, covered in plastic wrap with a sticky note attached. "Practice number 7, getting better." He recognized it immediately. Piper had been secretly practicing his techniques. He pulled it out, noticing another note tucked beneath. "For Jack, not perfect yet, but made with perfect intentions." The contrast between his assumption of her deception and the genuine effort behind this small, flawed offering created a lump in his throat he couldn't swallow past. The crust was uneven, clearly overworked in spots, but she'd attempted his signature lattice pattern, the one he'd shown her that night during the storm. She'd been paying attention to everything. "Well, you look properly miserable, which is a good start." Jack nearly dropped the pie as Mrs. Farnsworth's voice cut through the quiet. She stood in the doorway, not bothering to explain how she'd entered the locked bakery. "Mrs. Farnsworth, It's hardly trespassing when I've known you since diapers." She dismissed his startled look with a wave of her bejeweled hand. She moved into the bakery with surprising speed for someone her age, her cane tapping purposefully against the hardwood floors. "I didn't. I'm not here for pie, Jackson." She used his full name, a sure sign of trouble. "I'm here to make sure you haven't completely lost whatever sense your grandmother managed to instill in you." Jack set the pie down carefully. "I'm figuring it out." "Figure faster." Mrs. Farnsworth's assessment was brutally direct. That girl just put herself on display for the entire town, knowing full well she might be publicly rejected, by you and by Winterberry Ridge. When Jack began to respond, she sliced the air with her hand. "I'm not finished." She raised enough money to repair every storefront damaged in the storm, including your sign. Then she turned down 3 separate job offers from people at the auction. This stopped him. "Job offers? Apparently being a marketing wizard makes you valuable." "Who knew?" Mrs. Farnsworth's eyes narrowed. "The Hendersons offered her a position managing their mail-order maple business on the spot. Twice her city salary. She refused." "Why would she?" "Because of you, you impossible man." Mrs. Farnsworth jabbed a finger at his chest. "So the question, Jackson Whitmore, is whether you're brave enough to deserve her." She turned to leave, then paused. "Your grandmother wouldn't have let that girl get away. She'd have said you found a good one." The words landed like a physical blow. Evie Whitmore had been the toughest woman he'd ever known, but she'd also believed love was worth any risk. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers finding the smooth wooden handle of her favorite mixing spoon, the one he always kept with him during baking competitions. The door jingled as Mrs. Farnsworth left, leaving Jack alone again with the weight of his thoughts. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, not the harsh blizzard that had brought Piper to his door, but gentle perfect flakes that transformed Winterberry Ridge into the postcard version of itself. The kind of snow that made you want to stand still and watch, maybe with someone's hand clasped in yours. Jack moved to the window, watching the flakes spiral down. What terrified him wasn't that Piper might leave. It was that she might stay, and he would have to be worthy of that choice. He would have to trust that this time would be different. That she saw Winterberry Ridge, saw him, not as a charming chapter in her life story, but as the whole damn book. The smooth wooden spoon in his pocket reminded him of his grandmother's words. The secret to a perfect crust is knowing when to hold tight and when to let go. Jack grabbed his coat. He knew where he needed to be. The festival grounds were still buzzing with activity, despite the auction having ended hours ago. Volunteers disassembled booths and packed away unsold crafts, their breath fogging in the increasingly heavy snowfall. Jack scanned the crowd, looking for honey blonde hair and that ridiculous too-thin coat Piper insisted was perfectly fine for winter. She was nowhere to be seen. "Evie," he called, spotting the library director folding tablecloths. "Have you seen Piper?" Evie shook her head. "Not since the auction wrapped up." "Have you tried the inn?" "I think Ruth was offering her a room." Jack thanked her and moved on, his pace quickening as each location turned up empty. He tried the Ridgeview Inn, the library, even the small park where they'd watched kids sledding last week. No Piper. With each empty location, his normally composed facade cracked a little more. "You better fix this, Whitmore," Cal called from the doorway of his shop as Jack passed. She looked gutted when she left the square. "I know," Jack managed. "I'm trying to find her." Cal pointed north. "Try the bakery. Saw her heading that way about 20 minutes ago." Jack broke into a jog, dodging festival goers and nearly colliding with Mrs. Diaz, who informed him, "She cried when she talked about you, you know," before he could even ask his question. Snow collected on his shoulders and hair, as his pace quickened to almost a run. Another friend, another direction, another comment that twisted the knife of regret deeper. By the time he reached the town square, he was breathing hard, his eyes scanning frantically for any sign of Piper. And then, there she was. Sitting alone on the bench outside Frost and Crumb, snowflakes catching in her hair like tiny stars. Her shoulders were hunched against the cold, phone in her mittened hands, her expression a mixture of terror and resolve as she stared at the screen. Jack slowed his approach, suddenly uncertain despite his determination. She looked up at his footsteps crunching through fresh snow, her expression cautious but not closed, willing to listen but protecting her heart. He stopped several feet away, the distance between them feeling both infinite and paper-thin. "You made my grandmother's punch recipe," he said, then immediately wanted to kick himself. Of all the things he could have opened with. Piper blinked, confusion softening the wariness in her eyes. "What?" "For the auction." He gestured vaguely toward the square. "The punch. It's my grandmother's recipe. Nobody's made it since she died. I found it in her recipe box." Piper's voice was quiet, careful. "It was marked festival favorite. I thought." She shrugged slightly. "I thought people might like having it back." "They did." Jack took another step closer, his hands shoved deep in his pockets to keep from reaching for her. "You didn't have to do all this, the auction, the fundraiser." Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "I did. If I was leaving, I needed you to know it wasn't because I saw Winterberry Ridge as just a charming story. I needed you to know I saw it. I saw you for what you really are." The quiet certainty in her voice cut through his remaining defenses. "What am I then?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. "Home," she said simply. "For me, at least." She looked back at her phone. "I just sent my resignation email. 20 minutes ago." Jack stared at her, snow swirling between them. "You quit your job?" Piper nodded, a small nervous smile playing at her lips. "Terrifying, right? My mother's going to have a stroke. 10 years climbing the corporate ladder and I just jumped off." She took a deep breath. "I have no plan. No safety net. Just the certainty that I was succeeding at all the wrong things." Something broke open in Jack's chest, all the emotions he'd been trying to contain flooding through at once. He closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, then dropped to his knees in the snow before her bench. "I was wrong," he said, meeting her startled gaze. "About everything." "Jack, you're kneeling in snow." "I don't care." He took her mittened hands in his. "I've spent years making sure I didn't depend on anyone who could leave. Then you crashed into town, and within days I couldn't remember what Frost and Crumb felt like without you in it." His voice grew husky with emotion. "That terrified me more than any lie about being a travel blogger." Piper's eyes widened, hope flickering across her face. "Jack, I was so afraid of being hurt again, that I hurt you first." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his grandmother's wooden spoon, pressing it into her palm, along with the blue ribbon from the Winterberry pie-off. "My grandmother always said you know it's real when you're more afraid of regret than rejection." He curled her fingers around the items, holding her hands in his. "I don't care if you're a travel blogger or a marketing executive or secretly the Queen of England. I just care that you're Piper, the woman who color codes my coffee mugs and argues about pie crust technique and makes me feel like Winterberry Ridge isn't just where I'm stuck, but where I'm meant to be." Snowflakes caught on Piper's eyelashes as tears welled in her eyes. "I reorganized your mugs to be more visually appealing to customers," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "It's a proven retail strategy." Jack laughed, the sound startling in its fullness. "You and your marketing strategies. Did your research tell you to steal my heart too?" The smile that broke across her face was like sunshine after a storm. She tugged at his hands, pulling him up from his knees. "I resigned from my job 10 minutes ago," she repeated, turning her phone to show him the sent email. "I have no idea what I'm doing next, except that I want to be wherever you are. Arguing about pie techniques and fixing old signs and finding out if that ridiculous whisk superstition actually works." Jack felt his heart expand in his chest, making room for possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms in one fluid motion. "You're freezing," he murmured, noticing the tremble in her body. "Worth it," she whispered back, her eyes never leaving his. The kiss that followed was nothing like their first, no hesitation, no holding back, just the perfect certainty of two people who'd finally found home in each other. Her lips were cold from the snow but warmed quickly against his, her hands sliding up to cup his face as he pulled her closer, trying to eliminate any remaining space between them. As they stood there, snow falling around them, the bakery windows glowed golden behind them. Jack felt something settle in his chest, the knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful things begin with unexpected detours and imperfect starts. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Jack brushed snowflakes from Piper's cheek with gentle fingers. "Stay," he said, the word carrying all the weight of his heart. "Not just for the winter. Stay for good." Piper's smile widened as she pressed her forehead against his. "I already am." She reached up to touch his face, her eyes searching his. "You know this means I'm going to have opinions about everything in the bakery now. Your display case is practically begging for a makeover." Jack laughed, the sound carrying across the snow-covered square. "I'm counting on it," he said, then kissed her again, more softly this time. "But I draw the line at colored frosting on my classic apple pie." "We'll negotiate," she murmured against his lips. "I can be very persuasive. I've noticed." He gathered her closer, wrapping his coat around her as much as he could. "Let's get inside before you freeze. I'll make you coffee. In my color-coded mug. In whichever mug you want." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "As long as you're the one drinking from it." Snow continued to fall as they walked toward Frost and Crumb's door, hands linked between them, leaving a single set of footprints in the freshly fallen snow.
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.